Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is the final session on The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. We're doing part 4, the last 5 chapters. We're going to, the order today is Rob, Sherri, Maritza, Rupali, Joia, and Iris. Rob, take it away.
There.
Oh, we were muted. Okay. All right. So a couple of things I want to cover here. One is one that I can't pass up because, as Shrika mentioned earlier, starting next Saturday, I'm doing a writing course. As a writer, one of my most, and people can inquire, anybody who wants to participate can just inquire, send me an email, rwt@tracinski.com, let me know. But as a writer, one of my favorite descriptions of the process of writing is this section here where Wynand is writing the editorial of defense of, or describing why he is fired elsewhere Tui, and he sits down to write, and he says, the pressure disappeared with the first word he put on paper. He thought while his hand moved rapidly, what a power there was in words, later for those who heard them, but first for the one who found them. A healing power, a solution like the breaking of a barrier. He thought perhaps the basic secret the scientists have never discovered, the first fount of life, is that which happens when a thought takes shape in words. I love that. I love that because that, that describes everything that's good about the process of writing. Everything when the process of writing is going well, and everything that makes you, feel like yes, when you're doing it. Excuse me. When you're doing it. That's what is captured in here. And it's the important thing about the process of writing is that a reason why I'm a champion of the process of writing in this age where we do meetups and we do podcasts and we do a lot of audio stuff, much more than we used to, because we can. But the power of writing is that when I'm talking to you guys, even if it's just little faces on a screen here, I can, if I'm saying something, I can look at the reactions I'm getting from your faces, and either you're looking at me like this, like, what the heck is he talking about? Or you're smiling and nodding, you're saying, okay, I get that, yeah. And when I see the, okay, I get that, I know I'm getting through to you, I'm communicating, and it can be a lot easier to take shortcuts that way. To say, okay, you get my point, so I don't need to make it more exact or refined. When you're writing, you have to make everything very exact, very specific, very crystal clear. By the way, you can't always go from that. I gave a series of lectures once about 20 years ago, and there's one guy who sat in the front row every day looking at me exactly like that. Like he thought I was the biggest idiot in the face of the earth, and he couldn't believe this stuff was coming out of my mouth. And he came up to me after done the 4 lectures, over 4 days. He comes up to me and says, that was a great series of lectures. I got so much out of it. So you can't always go by facial expressions, I've learned. But generally speaking, when you're in a conversation, you have all these sort of shortcuts. The conversation can take a meandering turn. When you're writing, you have to put all the ideas in the right order. You have to anticipate all the objections. You have to choose the exact right words, the right phrases, the right images. It requires you to take an idea that could be vague and unformed in your head, or one that you thought was clear in your head, but wasn't actually all that clear. And it requires you to make it fully clear and fully objective. And I think that's what Gail Wynand is talking about here, this healing power, this breaking of a barrier, is this taking of a thought and making it fully exact and concrete and specific in words. And I also noticed this phrase, the first fount of life.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so what's this in a novel? It's a novel called The Fountainhead. So the first fount of life, that when you hear that in a novel called The Fountainhead, that's not accidental. So she's saying something, and we're going to get to this again a little bit in a moment. She's saying something about what the fountainhead is that's in the title. Is the fountainhead is the ability to form new thoughts, is the creative power of the mind. And in this case, the fountainhead, part of that creative power is the ability to find words to express an idea. All right, so just had to, as a writer, I had to do that. And so what happens here, though, is that Gail Wynand faces the ultimate sort of end of his career, which is that he's had this choice to make between being a first-hander, and then he's trying to be a first-hander using he's trying to use second-hand means to achieve a first-hand goal. The first-hand goal is he has his own independent thinking and his own internal mental and spiritual greatness. And he's trying to serve that goal by appealing to the mass lowest common denominator, the man whose face that nobody can recall. And he finds out at the end that this is impossible. That when he finally sets out to achieve a goal, use his power for a goal that fits his own internal firsthand standards, defending Howard Rourke, he discovers that all that power evaporates. Now, by the way, we have a word for this now, for what happens to Gail Wynand. There's a word for it that happened that's been developed relatively recently, and it's called audience capture. And it's a well-known phenomenon, especially online, where those Gail Wynand shows it applied to the old newspaper era as well. But it's really easy to see it happen online when you get somebody who becomes famous and gets a Substack newsletter with lots of subscriptions. And they have this, they get fame and wealth from promoting some kind of line, from pandering to a certain kind of audience. But then what happens is they become so focused on, I became famous and got a lot of attention by telling this particular audience what they want to hear. So I better go on telling them what they want to hear. And so the phenomenon is called audience capture. And we see that with, you have somebody who says something sensible and gets an audience go off the rails over the years. I've seen this with a couple of these there's been this phenomenon called the intellectual dark web, which is these, the independent intellectuals, people like Jordan Peterson, who are outside the mainstream. And I've seen a couple of these intellectual dark web types go off into like totally crackpot vaccine conspiracy theories and COVID conspiracy theories and all that sort of thing. And you wonder what happened to this guy. Well, part of what happened to some of them is audience capture. They got an audience of people who were enthusiastic because they were outside the mainstream and they were unconventional and they were contrarian. And then they found that their audience wanted them to go be contrarian, to take the contrarian stance on vaccines and on COVID and on this whole other list of other things. And some of them just get so wrapped up and they've got the feedback from the audience that they've raised for themselves, that the audience ends up dictating to them what it is they really want, what it is they should be saying. And they go off the rails and some of them started well and then go off the rails because they're so focused on what is my audience. I've got this giant audience. I'm making money off of it. I'm getting lots of attention. And what does my audience want to hear? And I'm going to keep telling them that. And that's really what happened with now Gail Wynand was audience capture from the very beginning, deliberately. That was his whole plan. But he didn't realize that he was getting captured by it. That he, in having his content dictated by what does it take to pander to this audience for all this time, that the minute he starts using it for something other than telling his audience something other than what they want to hear, his audience will turn against him. And so I think one of this thing where he gives in to his board, and then he goes walking through the city while Alvis Garrett is back writing the editorial denouncing Howard Rourke. He's walking through the city. I think this is some of Ayn Rand's best writing in all of her work, this scene here, where he's walking through the city and he ends up in Hell's Kitchen. And he says, I'm trying to find the specific. Yeah, here we go. I never got, he realizes he's in the middle of Hell's Kitchen, back where he started as a youth. I never got out of here. I never got out. I surrendered to the grocery man, to the deckhands on the ferry boat, to the owner of the pool room. You don't run things around here. You don't run things around here. You've never run things anywhere, Gail Wynand. You've only added yourself to the things they ran. And this, this is one of the most, I think, eloquent and heartrending passages in the whole book. But in here, I wanted to also pull out another little detail because I'm on the music beat here on this book. So there's a little section here. Now, in her notes for The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand wrote something very interesting about Elizabeth Toohey. She says, Toohey thinks he's against, says he's against Rockefeller and Morgan. John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, the big financiers and bankers and businessmen of the era. He says he says he's against Rockefeller and Morgan. He's actually against Beethoven and Shakespeare. And what she means by that is that it's not about being anti-big business. The socialism stuff is all veneer. He's really against greatness. He's against any one individual who's a conspicuous achiever. And of course, Beethoven and Shakespeare being, two of the instantly recognizable names. If you want to talk about a great composer, it's Beethoven. I think especially more so in the early 20th century, his reputation was even greater than it is now. And if you want to talk about a great writer, you talk about Shakespeare. And if you're a great English writer, you talk about Shakespeare. So it's Beethoven and Shakespeare. Well, I found it interesting that when Wyden is having this walk through the city, we get Shakespeare and not Beethoven, but Wagner. So here, let me read this section here. He walked past an open marble court, a cave cut deep into a building filled with light, spurting the cold air of air conditioning, the sudden cold of air conditioning. Now, by the way, movie theaters were the first air-conditioned spaces throughout most of America. It was a key selling point for a movie theater. In the middle of summer, you could go in and have air conditioning. So that was why this would be conspicuous, the air conditioning pouring out of the building. It was a movie theater, and the marquee had letters made of rainbows, Romeo and Juliet. The placard stood by the glass column of the box office. Bill Shakespeare's immortal classic, but there's nothing highbrow about it, just a simple human love story. A boy from the Bronx meets a girl from Brooklyn, just like the folks next door, just like you and me. He walked past the door of a saloon. There was a smell of stale beer. A woman sat slumped, breasts flattened against the tabletop. A jukebox played Wagner's Song to the Evening Star, adapted in swing time. All right, so what I want to point out is that this stuff's ripped out of the headlines because all this stuff was around her everywhere when she was writing exactly this sort of thing. Now, if we think, Romeo and Juliet reset in New York, we might think West Side Story, which is actually better than most of what was produced in this sort of genre because, West Side Story has interest, it has something attributed of its own in terms of music and in terms of, in terms of the storytelling and especially in terms of the music. So, West Side Story, of course, comes like 20 years after this, but there's a lot of these things. The key thing, aspect of this, so that's part about Bill Shakespeare, not William Shakespeare, Bill Shakespeare, and also that there's nothing highbrow about it. These are just like the folks next door. So you take this highly dramatic story by a great author, and you're dumbing it down, and you're making it just like the folks next door. And this thing about Wagner's Song to the Evening Star, adapted in swing time. So this was a real genre. I have an album at home with the title, Beethoven Wrote It, but it swings. And it's excuse me, I have a couple of excerpts I'm going to play for you here in a second. I was not able to find this like on YouTube or anything like that, so I can't play you the whole song. But at least give you a flavor for it. This album is a collection of various big band performers from the 30s who did classical music adapted to swing time. And it's not all terrible. I mean, Benny Goodman has a version of Ravel's Bolero that I actually prefer to the original, right? Because the original is, over and over and over and over again. And the melody never changes. It's never developed. It's repetitive.
But that's because you played the French horn part.
And well, I resent it because I played the French horn part, which is like 180 measures of and occasionally we change which note it is. So, but I find it a totally repetitive and boring piece of music. Benny Goodman does it. It has da 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 da. So you add this swing time beat to it. It's actually way more interesting on clarinet. But this was a whole genre, and some of them were, like I said, not so bad, and some of them were incredibly cheesy. And the title track of this album, let me see if I can share screen. Just for we're gonna go
not there. Here.
No, not there.
Not there. Not there.
It was here. We just said had to go in a different tab.
Oh,
okay, so here's the album. Beethoven Wrote It, but it swings.
Check out the cover
with an extremely cheesy cover. I don't think that's the original cover or anything. It's just they put it in there. But so you have Beethoven riffs on. Well, here's I'll try to see if I can get a little bit of Benny Goodman doing Bolero.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the title one, which is by, I believe, Dolly Dawn and the Dawn Patrol, which also sounds like, doesn't it sound like a character out of the Fountainhead, right? Dolly Dawn and the Dawn Patrol perform Beethoven. And she did the song, Beethoven wrote it, but it swings. Now, the excerpt I can get, the only thing I can get here is this little tiny excerpt. It doesn't quite give you the beginning. The beginning goes something like this. So Dolly Dawn starts out with her little patter at the beginning. She says, the old masters never had much talent for swing, but there was one who, if he did, could be the red hot rhythm king. And then she goes, and the whole piece is they play fairly straight little bits of Beethoven, and then they do it in jazz style. So this will give you a little bit of a swing style. This will give you a little flavor for it.
It's music any way it's played. So we know Beethoven wrote a minuet, and you can hear them play it, yes, like this.
All right, so unfortunately, the excerpt they give mostly has them playing Beethoven straight. So what she plays it straight, and then they go and do it in this, like, you know, but wouldn't it be better if, and then it's the jazz version. So this is totally Song to the Evening Star adapted in swing time. When she's talking about that, that's the sort of cheesy thing she's talking about. Where it's like, you know, if Beethoven's all well and good, but what if he were the red hot rhythm king of swing music? Now, yes, I want to give you a little taste of what the Song to the Evening Star is. Now, Song to the Evening Star, I don't think I found that the Wagner reference I found interesting, because from what I know, Ayn Rand was not a great Wagner fan. She found him sort of heavy and bombastic and too German, I think. But the Song to the Evening Star, I'm not surprised that would be the one for Wagner that she would like. It is, I think, the third greatest love song ever written. This
The first two.
People can ask about the first two. And the basic setup for this is that it's from Tannhauser, the opera Tannhauser. And so Elisabetta is in love with Tannhauser, our main hero. And I think that Wolfram is the character who sings this song, who's in love with Elisabetta. And he finds out that Elisabetta is dying of a broken heart, because this is an opera, and in an opera, people die of a broken heart. But unlike Tannhauser, who's a troubled character, Wolfram is a stand-up guy. His love is true and pure. You know, even though he knows Elisabetta doesn't return his love, that she's dying out of love for Tannhauser, his love for her endures untouched and faithful. And he knowing that she's dying, he sings a song to the evening star. O du mein holder Abendstern is the Abendstern is evening star. And the lyrics are basically saying, asking the evening star to catch hold of her soul as it comes by, and to take her up to live among the angels in heaven, right? So he's expressing his enduring and faithful love for Elisabetta. So go on.
You want me
Yeah,
to
do
play
that.
this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hope you.
Stop share.
Yeah, stop share. All right, so you get the idea. This is a very intense song of purity of his devotion. It's a very elevated sentiment. So the idea that taking that and breaking it down to swing time. Now, from as far as I can tell, nobody actually ever did a swing time version of Song to the Evening Star. But you know, this is a common thing. Actually, by the way, there's a group of guys who did in the 50s did something that was called these days we call it a jukebox musical, where you take like a popular artist or singer with a large catalog of hit songs, and you stitch those songs together with some vague kind of attempt at a plot tying them together, and you turn it into a Broadway musical. So they've done that with the Beatles, they've done it with Billy Joel, they've done it with ABBA, they even turned that into a movie. Well, these guys who did a series of jukebox musicals in the 50s, except it was taking various classical composers and putting music to those songs. Well, there's one particular composer who wrote it's a song for a ballet. It was in an opera, Prince Igor, that was then given popular music lyrics and became a hit. And it's, take my hand, I'm a stranger in paradise. Da, 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 dum, da, da, a stranger in paradise. Yeah, so we all heard that song. That was taken from a classical music composer, turned into a popular song and became very, very famous. And that was actually, I think, a well done adaptation. But like I said, this is a whole genre, and so she's tying into that, and it ties into in this version here with Bill Shakespeare and the song for the evening star and swing time. She's tying into what Ellsworth Toohey said in this speech just a little bit ago, or a few chapters earlier in the novel, about the sound perception of an ant does not include thunder, right? So if you take what is great and you make it small, and you get people used to, you enshrine what's small in place of what's great, then people won't be able to experience or appreciate greatness when they discover it. And that's sort of what she's talking about here with those examples. Now, that all brings us up to the most philosophical thing in the whole novel. I talked last time about how we're starting to get a lot more of explicit philosophical conclusions being drawn here towards the end of the novel. And we have the conversation about second-handers that Rourke has with Wynand, and we have the Toohey's confession to Peter Keating, in which a lot of these things come out. And of course, the speech, Howard Rourke's speech at his trial, is in much more detail, and he goes to the whole case against altruism. Now, I think the complaint about Ayn Rand is that her speeches are too long, and I kind of think they are. There's a little too much heavy philosophy in this that's not fully tied into the plot. But I'm going to explain why. I think there are two reasons why she's doing it. One of it is that I think, the argument against her in her long speeches is that, well, she really wanted to be a nonfiction writer and write about philosophy. And I think the exact opposite is true. I think she didn't want to be a nonfiction writer. She didn't want to write treatises of philosophy. So whatever she had to say about philosophy, she felt she had to cram it into the novel. Because if she had been planning, I'm going to write a treatise after this, about half of the stuff that's in Howard Rourke's speech, she would have said, I'll save that for the treatise. And if she'd wanted, Ayn Rand was not a shrinking violet. If she had wanted to write a treatise on philosophy right after this, she would have done that, right? But I think that she didn't want to go write nonfiction treatises on philosophy. So what she had to say about philosophy, she wanted to get into the novel. But there's another reason she wanted to get into the novel, which is, and I wrote about this, we're talking about Atlas Shrugged, where there are more speeches, and the big speech at the end of Atlas Shrugged is way longer than this one, and way more, with a lot more philosophical detail to it. And the point I make is that the title I use for a chapter on my book is called "Why Done It," which is that the Atlas Shrugged takes the form of a whodunit. There's a mystery, and you're trying to solve the mystery of why have all these things that have been happening in the novel been happening. What is the real key? What is the key action behind it? But in Atlas Shrugged, the finding out who did it is actually doesn't really solve the problem. It doesn't really resolve the plot. To resolve the plot, you have to find out why they did it. So it's not a whodunit, it's a why done it. That the basis of the character's actions is so unusual and unconventional, outside of mainstream way of thinking, that you can't explain who the characters are and what they're doing without explaining new ideas. And that's really the function that this speech serves as well, that you can't really understand all the conflicts that are going on and all the big issues that are at stake without having someone explain new ideas to you. I mean, the whole real essence of this speech is Howard Rourke making the case for the individual and against altruism. Well, altruism, especially at that time, was sort of practically synonymous with morality. Altruism was unassailably a good thing. And so for someone to come out of the case against altruism, you can see why you need a whole philosophical speech for that. But I wanted to focus just on the part where it sort of ties us back to 678. Here we go. It ties us back to the whole title of the novel and to the whole central theme of the novel. So his point is that the individual creator who's working for his own purposes is the source of all new values, the source of all things that move human life forward. And it says here, where do I want to start this? No creator was prompted by a desire to serve his brothers, for his brothers rejected the gift he offered, and that gift destroyed the slothful routine of their lives. His truth was his only motive. his own truth and his own work to achieve it in his own way. A symphony, a book, an engine, a philosophy, an airplane, or a building. That was his goal in his life. Not those who heard, read, operated, believed, flew, or inhabited the thing he had created. The creation, not its users. The creation, not the benefits others derived from it. The creation which gave form to his truth. He held his truth above all things and against all men. His vision, his strength, his courage came from his own spirit. A man's spirit, however, is his self, that entity which is his consciousness. To think, to feel, to judge, to act are functions of the ego. The creators are not selfless. It is the whole secret of their power, that it was self-sufficient, self-motivated, self-generated. A first cause, a fount of energy, a life force, a prime mover. The creator served nothing and no one. He had lived for himself. So this is getting us back to the fountainhead as the title of the, a fountainhead is what? It's a source from which water flows. And water is a life-giving substance, a source from which, clean, usable, life-giving water flows. And here he's saying the fountainhead is the ego, it's the self. And the self meaning your consciousness, your mind, your ability to think, to feel, to judge, and to act. So he's making the case of the ego, the self, not as a bad thing, but as the fount of energy, the fountainhead of all creation and all the things that move human life forward. So there's a lot else we can discuss in the speech, but I just wanted to draw out that where she brings it down to, ties it into the title in a way to make it clear that this is what the book is all about. This idea of the self as the source of all values. And then last thing I want to pull out in here is the very end of the novel. It ends with this image of Dominique, now Dominique Rourke, Mrs. Rourke, on the elevator going up to the top of the wine and building that's in construction. Let me see. I'm trying to figure out where I want to stop here.
Start.
Oh, here we go. She rose above the broad panes of shop windows. The channels of streets grew deeper, sinking. She rose above the marquees of movie theaters, black mats held by spirals of color. Office windows streamed past her, long belts of glass running down. The squat hulks of warehouses vanished, sinking with the treasures they guarded. Hotel towers slanted like the spokes of an opening fan and folded over. The fuming matchsticks were factory stacks, and the moving gray squares were cars. The sun made lighthouses of peaked summits. They reeled, flashing long white rays over the city. The city spread out, marching in angular rows to the river. It stood held between two thin black arms of water. It leaped across and rolled away to a blaze of plains and sky. Flat roofs descended like petals, pressing the buildings down, out of the way of her flight. She went past the cubes of glass that held dining rooms, bedrooms, and nurseries. She saw roof gardens float down like handkerchiefs spread on the wind. Skyscrapers raced her and were left behind. The planks under her fast feet shot past the antennae of radio stations. The hoist swung like a pendulum above the city. It sped against the side of the building. It had passed the line where the masonry ended behind her. There was nothing behind her now but steel ligaments and space. She felt the height pressing against her eardrums. The sun filled her eyes. The air beat against her raised chin. She saw him standing above her on the top platform of the Winen building. He waved to her. The line of the ocean cut the sky. The ocean mounted as the city descended. She passed the pinnacles of bank buildings. She passed the crowns of courthouses. She rose above the spires of churches. Then there was only the ocean and the sky and the figure of Howard Rourke. Now, notice how she's rising above all the other parts of society. The banks, the churches, the hotels, the office buildings, the warehouses, all the other parts of the society around her. She's rising above them all, leaving them behind, leaving only Howard Rourke, the ocean and the sky, and the Howard Rourke, and Howard Rourke above her. Now, this should recall to us the beginning, right? So the beginning of the novel, we started with what? It was Howard Rourke on a high pinnacle, just the sky and the rock and Howard Rourke and nothing else. And then what happens is he descends down, and remember where the first view of society we get is the town of Stanton began with a dump, right?
Yes, steaming, I believe it was.
Yeah, there's steam rising in tin cans, and she goes into some detail on describing the dump.
Delicious.
But it's the idea that the creator alone with nature is the highest and purest thing. And then when you go into society is represented, at least the beginning, society is represented by it's from a dump, and it's society that is this sort of problematic or corrupting influence on human beings. And we're sort of seeing that echoed here at the end, where instead of the town of Stanton beginning with a dump, we're leaving behind all the aspects of other people and society and the influence of other people, and going back to the individual alone, the individual creator alone in nature. So she's sort of ending at the very end of the novel, ending with a sort of reverse version of the image that she began with at the beginning of the novel. Right.
Wonderful, thank you, Rob. I particularly like the musical pieces. That was just wonderful. Thanks for singing. There were some.
Sherri's going to try to get me to sing "Song to the Evening Star," and I can do it. I appreciate that Wagner is like, for someone who sings a bass voice, Wagner provides some of the best music. Because usually the tenors hog all the good stuff and get the good artists. And it's been a while since I could attempt anything remotely like a tenor. So I appreciate. I can sing that song, but I can't sing it as well as Thomas Quastoff.
But I still think we might all need to hear it.
Yeah, if you can succeed in coaxing him to do that, that would be good. At
Maybe
whatever
you can
time.
all help.
Okay, sure.
Yes, I would.
So I wanted to talk. Whoever can ask the first question can maybe request that he sing that. That'll be fun. So I wanted to talk again about details. Several of the things I've brought up in our previous meetups have been about these little details and how they are adding to the depth of this work of art. And of course, I want to talk about color too today. But I want to start here with this heart-wrenching scene of Winan walking his way to Hell's Kitchen. And there's a couple details in here that I want to point out. He talks about, this is actually when he calls Howard to his office and refuses to speak to him like a friend, and talks to him about building the Winan building. And he tells Rourke, "This will be the last skyscraper ever built in New York. It is proper that it should be so. The last achievement of man on earth before mankind destroys itself." And I'm going to come back to this vision of skyscrapers at the end of my little segment here, but I want to point out how much this reflects Winan's view of himself, not so much his view of what's possible in the world. So he's thinking that the age of skyscrapers, and this did happen. This did periods of time when there'd be a recession and nobody was building skyscrapers, and people would be concerned that all the skyscrapers of the cities would be left as empty hulks with birds inside or something like that. Very dystopian. And that's happened throughout time. It's a common thought, but she's bringing it up in this particular case because it's so reflective of Winan, who's known as Joia mentioned last time. He has pulled that trigger, not figuratively, but emotionally. And that is why he is seeing this skyscraper as the last, and there is no more after that. And I'll keep that in your mind. We'll come back to it. But as he is doing his walk through the city, let me get this page 6. As he's doing his walk through the city, we're getting these wonderful touches. And if you're just reading, there's so much in here that it's easy. Maybe you need to read it 20 times before you get all these little details. Joia brought up one of them. As he's walking through the city, one of the little details is the figure in the salmon-colored negligee in a street window. That salmon color, I think, Joia, you're dead on. That's that feminine version of orange. That is another drip of the presence of Rourke in Winans' life as he's walking through the city. He cannot keep this vision out because, of course, he's confronting this major event that he has just created himself. And of course, we see in this walk, we see the vision of Howard Rourke showing up on the fronts of the newspapers, strewn in the water and the mud and the rain with muddy boot prints on and things like that. But we also have this little tiny touch right after the spot about the jukebox playing Wagner's Song to the Evening Star and Swing Time. Very next line is this: he saw the trees of Central Park. He walked, his eyes lowered. He was passing by the Aquitania Hotel. So here again, he can't get Rourke's presence out of his life. Everywhere he's walking, it's a constant reminder. So much so, he has to walk with his eyes lowered. So again, we'll get back to a different view of skyscrapers in a little bit here, but I wanted to carry on with this image of color or this importance of color in the book, but with the briefest stop here, because of course we finally get to the point. We talked about this early on. Dominique is always referring to Howard Rourke as Rourke. Even when she gets to the point where she admits that she loves him, she says, "I love you, Rourke." She doesn't say, "I love you, Howard." We get this moment brilliantly set up here where Dominique shows up unexpectedly at where he's staying in the summer in Monadnock Valley. She shows up. He's not expecting anybody to arrive, and she walks in and just says, "Howard." It's the first time she uses his first name, and the response is that he stands there looking at this as if he were looking at the sound of his name in the room, and he has all that he wants. It's such a beautiful moment. But right before that, as she's walking in, we have these other little details. Notice she comes in as if she had left this house half an hour ago. She wore no hat, no stockings, just sandals and a dress intended for backcountry roads, a narrow sheath of dark blue linen. Now it's interesting. We see her, Dominique, dressed in many different colors that ice blue, that are really indicating the fragility, the glass-like character, where we're getting, what's that?
And coldness.
And coldness. We're getting that impression that she's really fragile, breakable, but at the same time, we're having to counteract that impression because we see her strength in each of those moments. Well, that bluish green color, as we talked about the color wheel back then, and that orange color there, close to being opposite, but not dead on across from, in other words, they're not complete complementary colors. blue is the complete complementary color to orange. And that's a really important detail. I also love that this is the second time we see her dressed in linen. And this is also another important thing, I think, because it's that sense. Remember, we talked about this when Winan comes out of his sculpture gallery, where he has this, she once comments on how he looks lighter. And I think that this notice that we're getting that she's dressing in linen, it's a lighter, airier comfort, like home kind of, in this particular case, she's driving back country roads. This is a level of comfort and at one with oneself that we're getting in these references to linen. But we also have this wonderful thing that comes on the next page. As they're sitting and having a very, again, like normally happens, they slip into a routine that is like they've never left one another, even if it's been 7 years. And we have this at the bottom of, in my book, 667. She slipped down to sit on the floor, her elbows propped on his knees. She looked up at him and smiled. She knew that she could not have reached this white serenity except as the sum of all the colors, of all the violence she had known. And that, I think, is our notice for those of us who've paid attention to these little details. The artist here is telling us, yeah, and I meant it. I did, I meant it. So when we're paying attention to these little tiny details, they give us such a deeper appreciation for the work. And this is what allows really great works of art. You can look at them and absorb them so many more times because there's always another layer. There's always another connection that brings more of the story to life. And a couple of the other parts of this I wanted to bring out was, this is actually a page before she shows up in Monadnock Valley. She is stretched out at her house at the shore of the lake. And there is this, again, very lovely description. I'm always thinking here, when I read this description, I always think back to, excuse me, I need a drink of water. Rob drank all my water. Back to Louis Sullivan's description of spring. So here we have, she lay stretched on the shore by the lake. She's flat on her back, hands crossed under her head. She studied the motion of the leaves against the sky. It was an earnest occupation, giving her full contentment. She thought, it is a lovely kind of green. There's a difference between the color of plants and the color of objects. This has light in it. This is not just green, but also the living force of the tree made visible. And that has such this sense of being comfortable, such a sense of springtime, such a sense of that bursting forth of life, that I couldn't help but think of the boy on the bicycle. And right back here on page 503, we get this scene with the boy on the bicycle. And he's talking about, here we are, they are not, the leaves streamed down, trembling in the sun. They were not green. Only a few scattered through the torrent stood out in single drops of green, so bright and pure that it hurt the eyes. The rest were not a color, but a light, the substance of fire on metal, living sparks without edges. And it looked as if the forest were spread of light boiling slowly to produce this color, this green rising in small bubbles, the condensed essence of spring. And so we're now getting at the very moment just before she leaves before Dominique leaves her house at the lake to go visit Rourke, to go make that statement that she can now call him Howard. She is able to do that. It's that same spring-like feeling, that same love of the world that we have with the boy on the bicycle. And that brings me to the other skyscraper reaction. And that, of course, is Dominique coming to New York to see Howard Rourke during the construction of the Wine Building. And again, we just talked about spring and green and this freshness and this lightness. And we have here, she looked at the skyscrapers of the city. They rose from unexpected spots out of the low roof lines. They had a kind of startling suddenness, as if they had sprung up the second before she saw them, and she had caught the last thrust of the motion, as if she were to turn away and look again fast enough, she would catch them in the act of springing. And that is such a delightful description of seeing skyscrapers, and contrast that to Winans' description of the last skyscraper on Earth, which I can't even say without slumping my shoulders, because I think that what we're seeing here and these little details are showing us that final little connection that she had to make to understand that she doesn't have to be afraid, and she isn't. At the end of this, we see none of that matters. She fully admits that. It's all about that spring-like freshness and joy of living. And she finally gets herself to that point.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Sherri. And I love all the color things that you've done throughout this entire series. And I think I like the way in which you brought it together today. Wonderful.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Maritza, followed by Joia. Maritza, followed by Rupali, Joia, and Iris. Maritza.
Okay, so the end, we've arrived, right? For me, first I'd like to say, every time I read this book after the first, I always remember a little detail incorrectly. And I don't know why that is. At this point, I've read the book so often, there's no excuse for it. But in my mind, I'm always shocked to realize that there actually does not exist a scene where Gail Winan commits suicide. There's not an actual scene where he dies. And yet in my mind, I always remember him as being dead. Like he dies before the end of the book in my mind. And I think the reason is because he does die, right? He does commit suicide, even though he doesn't. So, but every time I read it, I'm shocked. And I'm like, where's that scene? Why do I remember it? There's a couple, I actually have like a list. It's actually a bulleted list. I don't know, I guess I was feeling industrious. The couple things that I wanted to go on, and they sound almost like generalizations. Oh wait, spoilers, I think. Tony just said that's the movie ending. I haven't seen the movie yet, so I don't know. Anyway, so there's a couple things here that I want to bring up and talk about. The first is, and there are different realizations that different characters made. The tragedy of Winan, obviously. The very first one I'm going to point out to you is the idea of, careful to whom and for what reason you give out a blank check. On page 657 of my very old copy, Winan is sitting with his directors, and he's having to make the decision to betray Rourke. And you know, they're all talking and everybody's discussing. He's not even listening to them. He's got an internal dialogue going on, which is heartbreaking and beautifully rendered by the author. And so they're all like trying to get him to make a decision. And meanwhile, he's got this like super loud litany going on in his head. And the interesting thing is he's looking at them. He's like, I know these people. These are the people I pointed out. And so, when he showed them the starving genius and the pregnant slut, and he's like, these are the people who I picked and I brought in. And to me, that sets the tone for these last few chapters of the book. In addition to several of the philosophical points that Ayn Rand is making seems too soft, because it's almost like she's shoving them down your throat. But in addition to those points, there is a lighter admonition to be ever cognizant of the tie between action and consequence. And we see that here in the very first 2 pages of chapter 16, when Winan is saying to himself, I signed a blank check long ago, and now it's presented for collection. But a blank check is always made out to the sum of everything you've got. And I think that is a very strong, powerful statement that is so ever missing in today's society. We are so divorced from our consequences that we stumble forward blindly, undertaking actions for which we may not be able to afford that check when people put their hand out for payment. And so that struck me as a really interesting thing. And also we'll see that because in Rourke's speech, he stands by his action. He does not shy away from it. He looks it straight in the eye, and he can live with that. Dominique, the same. Hers was a much more winding path, different roads, but again, they are accepting and they can accept the consequences. We see in Winan that he's not. It breaks him, that he's the embodiment of, there's another little banner statement that comes to mind for me, and I will read to you a quote by Albert Einstein. He'll tell you, you never fail until you stop trying. And what we see here is somebody who just gave up. He realized that most of his life he had been taking wrong steps, missteps. What he thought he was doing is not what he was actually doing. And in the face of seeing how absolutely wrong he was and how vastly he betrayed himself, he just crumbled and gave up. And I see in these few chapters also that very soft interwoven admonition to us that is also the wrong path forward. Now, it might be that what we're really being told is that if one chooses the similar paths that Winan took, in ignoring the fact that he wasn't meant to be a second-hander, and if one follows the path of second-hander, maybe then one is ill-equipped and or incapable of beginning again. But that's not the message I'm hearing, especially in the letter that Rourke gives him. Rourke tells him, that what you think you've lost can neither be lost nor found. Don't let it go. So what we're hearing here is this character who is set up to be the ideal. So your ideal is looking at you and saying to you, you think it's all lost. But I promise you, if you can manage to dust yourself off and take another step forward, it's still there. It can be yours. and the decision lies only within you. And I think that's a very powerful statement that it's, again, it seems almost like a very soft, hidden piece in the loud, proclamation of Ayn Rand's philosophical speech that comes just after. But I really think that's so important. And we see Winan just gave up. And he does it. And the sad part is he does it with full intention. He knows what he's doing. He understands that he's given up. When Dominique publicly, advertises herself as an adulteress and is with Rourke, and she shows up at their home, as it were, or what was their home, and he refuses to engage, other than to ask one or two questions. She gets angry. She's the one who expresses emotion. And she says it, and she's very, very angry. She says, if you can take it like this, you have no right to become what you became. And his response, that's why I'm taking it. Now, what did he become? What is she talking about? To my understanding, she's talking about the influence within her and Rourke's lives, because he's her catalyst. Winan is the catalyst for Dominique finding finally that courage to face her fears and to move past them. And she's telling him, if you show no emotion, acknowledge not your emotions, you don't deserve to be that. You're dismissing it. You're ignoring it. You're letting go. And he's saying, I understand that. And that's exactly why I'm doing it. And so to me, it's a heartbreaking embodiment of giving up. And what I hear in between these lines is the admonition for us not to give up. So if we are ever chasing the ideal, within that, we have to account for the possibility that we will have moments in our lives, because remember, we're human, right? We can't be the perfect ideals that are found in books. So we are going to find moments in our lives where we are Gail Winan. That which we think we are in control turns out to have been controlling us. And when that happens, how we react and how we respond will dictate our ability to ever approximate something resembling a Rourke. So that was just a huge point that I wanted to make there on Gail. And as we see, the final curtain for Gail Winan is of someone who was not supposed to be a second-hander, realized it. And you want to say he realized it too late, but the only reason it was too late was because he chose to give up. The fascinating contrast to that is I just want to briefly point out the idea. I just want to briefly point out an opposing view, right? So Guy Francoeur, when we were first introduced to him in this novel, he was a very well-renowned architect. And I say architect in quotes because he didn't actually do any of the architecting. And, he was flippant. He was he kind of was fairly useless as an architect, as a father, as a friend, as a mentor. And he knew it somehow. So he and Peter Keating's mother both had this despair of, what does my life matter if I could not have somehow done something worthwhile? And she's approximating her worthiness and her worth to her son and his happiness and success. He was approximating his to the progeny of his work. But what I thought was just beautiful and poignant here is that he understood without words Dominique's actions. He had never understood his daughter throughout the entirety of the book. But when she left Wynand to be with Rourke, he found himself a clarity previously missing. So in understanding that his daughter required something and had previously not found it, in understanding that, he found his own bit of peace. Now, in these last few chapters, Ayn Rand uses the word happiness more than she uses it in the entire rest of the book. I am not a fan personally of people who are espousing the need for pursuing happiness, because I will advocate to anyone who listens to me that one should never actually pursue happiness. I think that's the best way to miss it, right? I say instead, pursue things of meaning, things of value, and let happiness be a byproduct of pursuing that which has meaning. But it bothers me less hearing it from Ayn Rand, because I suspect she felt the same way. When she speaks of pursuing happiness, she does so in the arena of, elevating the ideal. So when she's speaking of pursuing happiness, she's really telling you, pursue that which has meaning, because that she is synonymizing that which has meaning with happiness. And it's interesting that this flippant architect, non-architect, he finds his peace by hearing something that most miss. And in doing so, both he and his daughter gain something. And I think that's just a beautiful way to also shine a spotlight on this point that in my mind, it's a soft point she's making about not giving up. He had never understood his daughter. He thought he was doomed to never understand her, to be a failure as a father, and to be unfulfilled in that arena. And that she would always be miserable and misunderstood. But Ayn Rand shows us his understanding and their connection, I believe, as the contrast to Wynand's just given up. Because if this flippant personality, this character, whom we've written off by now, he's like faded into the sunset, right? This miserable, useless guy, you served your point. He comes back to do that which the vast personality of Gail Wynand could not. And I just thought that was really interesting and just beautifully woven for us from the perspective of an author, and just fascinatingly done to me, the idea of showing us that we can still, all is not lost. If there's hope for him, surely there's hope for you. And what a pity it is that Gail Wynand could not see that. And I really do, in the vein of that, it's interesting because when Dominique comes to Howard, he's trying to convince her to wait. And there's a little blurb there talking about him trying to make an exception. His love for Gail Wynand is such that he is attempting a compromise. He's attempting something which is vastly unlike his character. And he would make a sacrifice for his love of Gail. And that's adding another little component to us, that when Ayn Rand speaks of the loftiness of love and the fact that love is the most selfish thing in the world, she speaks to it from this perspective. It's not just romantic love. Any level of emotion that one can feel for one's fellow human being, it stems from a love of oneself, and it explodes outward, so much so that he's waited 7 years. The only love of his life is standing in front of him, ready, willing, a moment he's been waiting for, a moment he was not sure would come, And yet his love for this other person is so vast that he would sacrifice for that person if he could. And I just, it's an interesting and a poignant and what thing here that we see, and these are the softer points, I believe, that are interwoven, and it's all part of Ayn Rand's philosophy, the idea of, without the self, all is lost, right? That's the softer version of what she's really saying to us. And I am going to avoid reading too much from The Fountainhead, but what I will do, and what I cannot resist doing, is I'm going to read you guys one quote from Atlas Shrugged. Because during Howard Roark's massive speech, this is the quote that comes to mind for me ever since I read Atlas Shrugged. Now, I will say that I actually read Fountainhead first and then Atlas Shrugged. I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine. This is the oath that the thinkers recite when they join the strike and they come to live in the valley. If you're unfamiliar with Atlas Shrugged, I do apologize. But basically this is an invocation for your understanding of the presence, of the concept of egotism and individualism as Ayn Rand defines it. So this here is what we're seeing when Dominique stands there before him, so calm and so assured. And she is entirely she has no pity whatsoever for Gail Wyman. And Roark says to her, he had no choice. And she goes, he did. And I've said that to people often. It's like, they're like, oh, I had no choice. Nope. You had a choice. You didn't like your options, but you made a choice. Even if you make no choice, you are making a choice. And what comes to mind for me, there's time. When people are late, I tell my nieces, I was like, I don't have children. So, I do my practice parenting on nieces and nephews. And I would say, just so you realize, it's fine that, my niece come, oh, I'm so sorry. Mind you, I'm waiting at her at the restaurant now, 15 minutes. She's like, oh, I'm calling an Uber now. I'm like, you're 20 minutes away. And so what I would say to them is, I was like, just remember, whenever you're late, you're telling the person that you believe your time is more important than theirs, because we all have 24 hours in a day. Every moment you are making the choice of how you're going to spend these minutes and hours. And if you chose to not be timely, it is because you made the decision to do something else because it was not important to you to show up at our pre-described hour. So why am I going on this tangent with you? Because this is what Dominique is saying of Gail Wyman. He could have shut down the banner and elevated his friendship over his banner. And Roark, again, his love for Gail, he's saying it was his life. And I love her response. This is mine. What I hear when she says in those 3 words, this is mine, I hear that quote from Atlas Shrugged. I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine. And why is that so impactful? Because that is all Dominique does for the entire other 600 and 700 change of pages prior to that moment. She is not living throughout the rest of the book. But in that moment, she takes her life. And not only does she take it, she takes it to live, which is fascinating to me and admirable. And it's that whole, even though she spent all that time negating living, we're again fed. It's not too late. I hear that in the background here in all of these. It's not too late. It was not too late for Gail either. He made it too late by his refusal to dust himself up and keep going. And that's why, again, that, the Einstein quote, because until you decide you're going to stop, it's not done. Don't count you out. You can keep going. Even if they count you out, just keep going. And so that to me was like, and that, I don't know, I think that's what I stayed on this time more, perhaps, because I will say this is only my second time reading it since after I've had to reconstruct myself. So it just gives me a slightly different perspective on many of the aspects here that we have in the book. And I think that it is going to be greatly covered, other things in detail by others. So I will go ahead and stop here. Thank you, Shrikant.
Thank you, Maritza. I want to, in the question and answer period, I do want to talk about Winan. The final kind of end of Winan, because it's always puzzled me. So would love to talk about that. But great. Next up is Rupali, followed by Joia and Iris. Rupali.
So these last few chapters, Ayn Rand has done a phenomenal job of bringing her philosophy, I would say, in terms of the use of glass in the book that Sherri has pointed several times. Her philosophy becomes crystal clear through the words of Howard Roark, through the actions of Gail Winan and Dominique. So the whole idea about first-handers versus second-handers. What is the fountainhead of human existence? What is the sense of life? Why do we need reason? What is the ability to create? What is the essence of happiness? Where does it come from? The values, the sense of integrity, staying true to yourself. And throughout the book, we see that Howard Roark was able to maintain it, and he demonstrates through this book that this life of having a strong moral character and being practical is possible here and now. I think that has been my biggest takeaway from The Fountainhead. And then you also see the contrast, and I think she's, for me, I've focused on the contrasts in this book throughout this conversation. And the contrast of people who don't have any values, whether we take Toohey or Keating, Winan, who has a sense of values but does not have the integrity to uphold his values. So how do they end up? All of that comes together in this section. The rise to power and their downfall, all of that is very well culminated in this section. If we start at the beginning of the book with the quote, she says, Ayn Rand says, whatever their future, at the dawn of their lives, men seek a noble vision of man's nature and of life's potential. So if that's the nature of men, to seek the highest potential, then how is it that we have all these different characters, right? And Ayn Rand not only brings about Ellsworth Toohey, Peter Keating, Winan, but she has all of Toohey's puppets that she brings and really paints a great picture. What drives them away from the vision of the ideal man? What is it that power does? Or if I go back to Shrikant's diagram of the Bhagavad Gita, what drives people away from the center? And it is a choice, fundamental choice that we as human beings make. So when Winan is given the opportunity to change and transformation are hard. He's given the opportunity, but he clings on to that desire of power. And although he realizes that he has no power left, he is unable to change, he is unable to transform. And you can see the love, the hope that Howard Roark has. You see that love throughout the book for humanity. You see his love for Stephen Mallory. You see that he is compassionate about whether it was with Henry Cameron, and he is trying to help. He's hoping that Winan would stick to his values, but he doesn't. So that love for what's possible exists in Howard Roark. All of that kind of comes together in the section. I think the whole idea of nature and nurture is also well defined in Howard Roark's speech. And I'm going to go back to Kindergarten Chats by Louis Sullivan in this case, because as I read Howard Roark's speech, every time I read, I say, oh, that's what Louis Sullivan was saying in chapter 2, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to highlight a few of those details. So one thing that Howard Roark says is that every human, and Ayn Rand makes this point, right, through Howard Roark's words, is that every human being has that potential to think, to reason, to create, and to transform the world that we live in. But that human potential has to be nurtured, and it has to be held at the forefront, because otherwise negative things can happen. And if you look at, so I'm going to read a little section from Kindergarten Chats by Louis Sullivan, where he says, the hard fact that American building is demoralized and architecture is not, and the architect not only mentally unhinged from his art, but socially and economically out of joints with his time. It is a curious condition we see, a tangled skein that it will require patience and perseverance to unravel. The way is plain to me. To make it plain to you is quite another matter. Yet the facts are there, and we must look them squarely in the face. We must find the way out to a pure air or perish. And so Louis Sullivan starts this book of Kindergarten Chats by saying, let's look at this problem and let's understand what are the causes behind this. And I think Ayn Rand has done a very good job from the beginning to the end, where she carries us through the thread of saying, okay, what are the causes of destruction? What are the causes of, not seeking our highest potential? And if you do nurture it, Louis Sullivan in his chapter called The Garden, very appropriately, we've seen how everything comes to bloom and flourish towards the end of the book. Louis Sullivan talks about the human spirit. He says it's all within you, and that we can find it, we can nurture it, we can cultivate it, we can train it, and we can transform ourselves with due time. So that's kind of the idea in this book too, that we all have that human spirit, and it's up to us how we cultivate it, how we recognize it, and true to our values. The other part, so I'm going to read a little bit from Howard Roark's speech. In chapter 18, Howard Roark talks about the vision that the very first humans have, right? The very first person to create. Now, one thing in Montessori we do in Montessori education is we always say, who was the first person to come up with the idea of money? Or who was the first person to come up with something? And so all the history lessons are like, who was the first person? And I think that having that idea of who was the first person to take that chance? Who was the first person to disagree? Who was the first person to make that leap of imagination, take that thought and move forward? So what does thinking do? I'm going back between multiple things. I'm going to talk about a little bit of Bhagavad Gita, Louis Sullivan, and Ayn Rand, and I'm just going in like kind of a circle with all of that.
Go right ahead. This is very good. Please go ahead.
Okay, all right, thank you. So in Bhagavad Gita, there are multiple ways you can reach your highest potential. There's not just one way. And one of the ways is Jnana Yoga, which is knowledge, right? And knowledge comes from understanding, from your sensory inputs, just being aware, just being able to observe and then understand what is and what it is for. Once you are aware and you seek more knowledge, whether it's through education or through work that you do, you start building experience. You start understanding what makes things happen. And you see this early on, Rourke understands what a marble is, what the qualities are. He understands the science behind it, the engineering concepts that are required for building tall structures. So he's very knowledgeable. Now, taking knowledge and then understanding experience, making it go even further, that's where you have the ability to think, the ability to reason. And Louis Sullivan talks about thinking as a philosophy. So Louis Sullivan says, thinking is philosophy. The best that reading and listening can do is to stimulate you to think your own thoughts. Reading is chiefly useful in that it informs you of what the other man is thinking. Thinking is always imitative. Real thinking is always creative. You cannot create unless you think. You cannot truly think without creating in thought. Judge your present architecture by this standard. Moreover, real thinking only happens in the present tense. You cannot think in the past. You can only think of the past. You cannot think in the future. You can only think of all things possible in the future. By great power of imagination, you may think of the past and the future almost in terms of present. The one in the function of historian, the other that of the prophet. But reality is of, in, by, and for the present, and the present only. Bear this strictly in mind. It is important. It must be at the very root of your new education. So the whole idea about thought and thinking, the ability to reason, that is so unique to humans. And I like the way Ayn Rand talks about Dominique's understanding of the world. She says the world is a backdrop and things are happening. The world is going to be there. It always has been, always is, will remain. And it's our actions that will make the change in this world. So going back to Bhagavad Gita, once you have the knowledge, you can expand the frontiers of the knowledge and result in progress, make progress. You can push those boundaries of what is by using your reason, by using your imagination, by dreaming. So Howard Roark continues to do that without compromising his integrity throughout the book. You see whether he gets a small project or a large project, all of his projects have a distinct mark. They reflect his personal values, and he is transforming the world for the people who are its occupants. When he's in the summer house at Monadnock for the summer, he says he's enjoying it just as much as the occupants are enjoying it. So if it gives you life, it's going to give life to others too. I think that was done very well. Now, the other big idea is freedom. And Howard Roark says, let me just see where I am. When Howard Roark is standing in front of everybody, he's on page 677 in my book, it says, Roark stood before them as each man stands in innocence of his own mind. But Roark stood like that before a hostile crowd, and they knew suddenly that no hatred was possible to him. For the flash of an instant, they gasped at the manner of his consciousness. Each asked himself, do I need anyone's approval? Does it matter? Am I tied? And for that instant, each man was free enough to feel the benevolence of every other man in the room. So again, this is the Bhakti Yoga that we keep talking about in Bhagavad Gita. And I know several people in this meetup are also part of that group. So I just thought this was very well said. Talking about freedom, I have to find where my notes are. So freedom is a big part of creation. And for the creator to be able to produce, the creator has to be completely free and be independent to work with his own mind. So both Louis Sullivan and Ayn Rand, and actually I will even add Maria Montessori, the whole idea of Montessori education is to develop independent thinking. So when I see this, in all three books, Maria Montessori as well as Louis Sullivan and Ayn Rand, I just thought I would talk a little bit about this section. Give me just a minute to find my place. So Louis Sullivan talks about freedom in the word democracy, and democracy means not just the democracy as we know as a country, but the idea that your mind is free, your soul is free, your spirit is free. So when Louis Sullivan talks about democracy in Kindergarten Chats, he says, "This is the conception of democracy I hold. Ours is the land of destiny, to be the home of free men, free in their bodies, free in their souls, that the silently working calm and power of the wilderness, the potency of soil, of the waters, the air may permeate them physically, mentally, morally, and spiritually, and lift them up to be a great people, animated by a great purpose, a great force, a great beauty, the beauty and the power and the glory of democracy, the divine altitude of man's humanity." And Maria Montessori says the purpose of education is to help life. What is life? Life is this need for freedom, this need to be able to recognize that every soul, every individual has this freedom. There's independent thought, there's independent conduct. And where education can give help to develop this human personality, then the child can achieve independence. So she goes on to say that in her book, The Formation of Man, she says, but this is not always possible, because even though she was showing that it's possible to teach independence, it's possible to foster independence in children, we have prejudices. It's the existing prejudices. And I think that Fountainhead has done a fantastic job in showing us those prejudices that, we feel, how is it possible? And often I hear when people talk about the Fountainhead that this is not a practical way of living, but the more we live true to our values, it becomes very practical. I have to find this quote about freedom. Okay, creation and independence. So what does creation and independence have to do with each other? Howard Roark says, the basic need of the creator is independence. The reasoning mind cannot work under any form of compulsion. It cannot be curbed, sacrificed, or subordinated to any consideration whatsoever. It demands total independence in function and in motive. To a creator, all relations with men are secondary. So to be able to have the ability to think independently, you also need an environment that fosters that independent thinking. So Men exchange their work by free mutual consent to mutual advantage when their personal interests agree and they both desire the exchange. If they do not desire it, they're not forced to deal with each other. They seek further. This is the only possible form of relationship between equals. Anything else is a relation to slave or master or a victim or executioner. So every creative job is achieved under the single guidance of an individual thought. What he does with them is his individual product and individual property. That is the only pattern for proper cooperation among men. And so how do people live in harmony? How do people live with dignity, with proper relationships? I think Ayn Rand does a very good job of explaining this. It's almost like a thesis of what her philosophy is. And then she talks about America. So Howard Roark says, now observe the results of a society built on the principles of individualism. This is our country, the noblest country in history of men, the country of great achievement, greatest prosperity, greatest freedom. This country was not based on selfless sacrifice, renunciation, or any precept of altruism. It was based on a man's right to the pursuit of happiness, his own happiness, not anyone else's, a private, personal, selfish motive. Look at the results. Look into your own conscience. Now, last night, Rohit and I were watching a movie and it was all about we are better than Americans. And I was like, why? Rohit said, why do they have to compare themselves to Americans? But hey, there is a standard that's set over here. There is a standard. And what is your standard? So I want to go to what Louis Sullivan says, and give me just a minute to find it. He's talking about a bank. Louis Sullivan is talking about a bank, and he says, who are you? What is your value? What is your worth? What is your standard? By what standard will you live your life? And okay, so in Louis Sullivan's book, why is it important to have the freedom that we see in America? Here he says, in its own courage, democracy would abolish fear, would banish it, would dispel it as a fetid ghost. It would blow down, it would dissolve the wall that fate has seemed to rear. It would expose the world to man's clearing vision. Thus, it is necessary in a democracy that men in all walks of life, especially those who assume to be leaders in thought, qualify, each in his way, in all inclusive art of expression. For democracy has real things to express. It insists on expression. It will make sure they're expressed. And so it is in development of this technique, such as art, that modern man is to concentrate his thought, bend his faculties, and exercise his superpower as the creator. So, Louis Sullivan, I think, has the germ of what individual thinking, what a free society. And in Maria Montessori, we see how you can start developing nurturing those qualities in education. And then in Ayn Rand's Fountainhead, you can see it completely come to its fruition. It's a beautiful journey with all three thinkers. And I will end with one part where Sherri read about how Dominique is soaring up above the skyscrapers and going up to meet Howard Roark. I think when Louis Sullivan talks about, in his essay, tall office building artistically considered, right? He talks about what does a tall building mean? He says, it demands of us, what is the chief characteristic of a tall office building? And at once we answer, it is lofty. This loftiness is to the artist's nature its thrilling aspect. It is the very open organ tone in its appeal. It must be in turn the dominant chord of his expression of it, the true existent of his imagination. It must be tall, every inch of it tall. And as you read the last section of the book, the 20th chapter, you see, you can actually feel soaring up, and that's a very nice way to end the book. The man who designs in this spirit and with a sense of responsibility to the generation he lives in must be no coward, no denier, no bookworm, no dilettante. He must live of his life and for his life in the fullest, most consummate sense. He must realize at once and with the grasp of inspiration that the problem of the tall of his building is one of the most stupendous, one of the most magnificent opportunities that the Lord of Nature in his beneficence has offered to the proud spirit of man. So with that, I will end my conversation about Louis Sullivan, Ayn Rand, and Montessori. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. I really love the thing. And I think Louis Sullivan is fundamental. You can't really understand The Fountainhead without Louis Sullivan. And it's great that you brought it up so many times in so many different ways. Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Joia.
So today I really want to make sure that we talk about the triumph of Howard Roark, because this is the Howard Roark section. This is the climax. This is the finale of the book. So that's what I'm really excited for us to talk about. But before we get to that, I do also want to say a couple things about Gail Wynand. And I do have some questions about Gail Wynand too. So I'm hoping that maybe we can even have a discussion about this, because I'm really even curious to hear from the other panelists, because there are some questions about this character that is, as much as I've tried to unravel him and understand him, that I've never really understood. But to start talking about Wynand, there's this question that a lot of readers, I think, have when they get to the end of the book and get to the end of Wynand's character. This question of, can Wynand be saved? Is there a possibility of redemption for Wynand? And I want to say, as a little bit of a teaser, because I think at some point we all have to read Atlas Shrugged. And when we do, I want to say, I think there's going to be a really interesting parallel for us to explore. And hopefully this doesn't give away too many spoilers. But at the end of Atlas Shrugged, there's an interesting question about, can Eddie Willers be saved? And I think when we get to there someday, and I know it's going to be a while, and especially because it's the end of that book and it's very long, but someday when we get there, I want to plant this little seed that I want us to explore this parallel between, can Eddie Willers be saved, and can Gail Wynand be saved? And so I've perhaps famously or infamously come out on this meetup before on the side of team redemption for Peter Keating. And admitting definitely that it would be incredibly difficult and hard, and maybe he really doesn't have enough of that internal energy to go through with it. That for Peter Keating, the very fact I see that he took that step to go out in the woods and paint, to follow that first-handed desire, and that even when he went there, that he didn't do the Peter Keating thing of just trying to copy all the other painters, but really tried to express something that was authentic to the way that he saw and experienced the world. That little seed, that little glimmer, is what gives me the sense of why there is at least a possibility of hope for Peter Keating. But with The Fountainhead, what Ayn Rand shows us, and what I think is absolutely consistent with her view about what is the fountainhead in human existence, and that it's ultimately going to boil down to the choice of the individual. My answer to the question of, can Gail Wynand be saved, is that we see that Gail Wynand cannot be saved, but it is precisely because of the choice that he is making. And I think Maritza brought up a really fascinating point, that we see even that Howard Roark, up till practically the very end, believes that Gail Wynand can be saved. So that, it's not that there was some awful, black, hideous thing that he did that made it such that, this was a dividing line. And, once you cross that line, you can't ever be saved, at least in Howard Roark's estimation. And then, presumably in the author's estimation, that there could be a possibility for Wynand to come back in spite of everything. But to me, it's even interesting Roark's recognition of when and why that's not going to happen. So I even wanted to take us to that part of the book first. So let me just get to my page here. But if we remember, Wynand through his secretary has called Roark, to have him come, and Roark is excited. He really sees maybe this is the sign that Wynand is ready to come back. And he has that sense of excitement when he enters the building that used to be the Banner building, but now it's just for the Clarion. And he's going to go up the elevator, and maybe there's this nice, interesting parallel to, Dominique rising in the elevator, because maybe, there's that sense of the possibility. There's that sense of, something exciting that can happen here at the end. And we hear, Roark's emotions. He was glad to be the only passenger. He felt a sudden violent possessiveness for the small cage of steel. It was his, found again, given back to him. The intensity of the relief told him the intensity of the pain it had ended, the special pain like no other in his life. And here again, too, I think we see even just how much Wynand has meant to him, that this pain of having lost Wynand has been the pain that had such an intensity like no other in his life. But then what happens? When he entered Wynand's office, he knew that he had to accept that pain and carry it forever, that there was to be no cure and no hope. Wynand sat behind his desk and rose when he entered, looking straight at him. Wynand's face was more than the face of a stranger. A stranger's face is an unapproached potentiality to be opened if one makes the choice and effort. This was a face known, closed, and never to be reached again. And this, I think, is even just it beautifully harkens back to the first time when Roark and Wynand encountered each other. It was in this same office, this same building. And if you remember there, it was a kind of love at first sight moment that they were able to see each other and have this instant recognition of who the soul of the other person, the character of the other person, and recognizing that greatness within each other in that first glimpse, it seems. And here again, Roark, in this first glance that he's going to see in Wynand, is going to see that Wynand has made a choice, that Wynand has closed something off. And to me, that is the answer as to why Wynand is, I see it presented in this book, at least, as beyond redemption, because Wynand has made this choice, because Wynand has, and it's suggested here, made this final choice to close himself off and to not allow this possibility for redemption in his life. And that's what I see the author as telling us here. But to me, that there's still something about this whole scene that is confusing, and with the end of this book and Wynand's character that I've never really understood. So if we go back even a couple chapters, and in our last meetup, I had talked about how I thought it was even striking how we never see dramatized Wynand's realization of the grave error that he has made in his life. We see him in the midst in all the excitement of the crusade, and then all of a sudden we get this cut where we go to the boardroom scene, and Wynand has now this has already had this realization that that he's lived his life wrong. And and then he has that point where he has to choose between the banner or his crusade. And we see in that moment that he chooses the banner. And then he goes on his, long walk of regret and remorse, which both Rob and Sherri, that is one passage where I do, and Rob had said, this is just some of the best writing, and I absolutely agree. That's one section I could have read the whole section of the Winans walk there because it's so beautiful. I'm glad both Rob and Sherri gave us some little pieces of that walk. But then it's so Winan then has this realization finally of the error that he's made. But then there's something even interesting to me in the dramatization of the courtroom scene. So if you remember how that scene ends, that the jury is going to come back and give the verdict to Howard Rourke. And Ayn Rand makes it this really dramatic moment where Rourke stands up to face the jury, and Winand in the back of the courtroom stands up to face the jury as well. And there's the sense that that what the jury is going to say, that this is going to somehow determine Rourke's fate, but that it's going to have some kind of determination on Winand's fate as well. But this is something that's always seemed kind of curious to me, even just kind of considering the counterfactual. So if it were the case that the jury had come back and, given the verdict that, that Rourke was guilty and we're going to lock him up, like what difference would that have actually made for Winand, even in his realization of himself, that, even if this particular jury, I guess, had made this determination, I don't think that would have somehow saved Winand or would have given him any reason to think differently about the error that he had made. So that to me has always just been maybe a little bit confusing. And I'd love to hear kind of what other people maybe think about that question. Maybe how it might have been different for Winand if the verdict had somehow come down differently. So I would say I love the drama of, Winand realizes that, that he is on trial as well. But there's just that little piece of it that I've never quite understood. And then also even in this last sequence, I totally understand what Maritza said, that she always thinks in the book that Winand has committed suicide by the end, because that's the other thing about this, that it's always been a little bit puzzling to me about this character. And again, like I appreciate the drama of, she wants to give us that this is a moment of the spiritual suicide, and clearly she set us up for that from the very beginning of the Winand character when we first introduced to him, and we're seeing him in that moment where he's actually holding a physical gun. And she really wants us to make this connection that that this is definitely a moment of spiritual suicide. But it's never been clear to me, like, why doesn't Winand actually commit physical suicide? Like, what is Winand still living for? Like, what is his motive going on? And even, we get here sort of at the end where he's going to describe to Rourke that, he's giving, Rourke the commission for the building, and that Rourke doesn't have to worry that it's just going to be an empty building, and he says here, it is an open secret that the so-called Winand Empire is dead. It is sound and doing as well as ever throughout the country, with the exception of New York City. It will last my lifetime, but it will end with me. I intend to liquidate a great part of it. And so I think there's maybe even something really significant that that at least he's chosen to end the New York City part of his business, that with all of his love and appreciation for New York City, and with sort of the new realization of who he's been, that he can't keep going in New York City. But it's always even been curious to me that, we saw in that scene that he made the decision to give up the crusade and save the banner. But then, shortly after the courtroom scene, we were going to see he decides to just give up the banner, like there again, there's that great, wonderful, dramatic moment where he brings in Tui for the last 5 minutes because they have to comply with the law. And then Winand is going to close down the banner. And again, like I love the drama of the moment, but it's like, I've never really understood the character. It's like, you made this momentous decision to choose the banner over Howard Rourke. And then it's just like, with seeming no sense of the consequence of it, it's just like, well, we're just going to give up the banner, and what motivates Winand to even keep going with the Clarion and the rest of the paper throughout the US, and he's already saying, it's going to end with me. I'm going to liquidate a great part of it. Like, to me, it's almost just like, at the end of a book, you kind of want there to be that sense of resolution. And I never get that sense of resolution with Winans' character, because it's this open question to me of like, what's Winan living for as the book goes on? So that's something I've just never been clear about. So I'm going to love to hear from, the rest of, the panelists and everybody in the group who's read the book, what you might think is what's still motivating Winan to actually keep living and not commit suicide at this point, when he's clearly committed spiritual suicide, and everything else going on. But
okay, so before you go on, I just want to remind everybody. So after the presentations, we're going to talk only about Winan.
No,
all questions. No, okay, all right. Okay, we're going to talk about Winans and then anything anybody brings up. But I do want to talk about Winan, because there's so many interesting questions. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will go for that, and then anything else.
So I do want to talk about Winan, but that cannot be the only thing we talk about, because the best part, the most important part of this whole section definitely has to be the triumph of Howard Roark. And so I just even wanted to spend some time just even talking about some of the little literary details of the ending part of the book here. And I absolutely love how Sherri has kind of taken us through and shown us all of these beautiful little visual details that populate the book. It almost makes me wish we could now just go back and reread the whole book again and just focus on some of the little literary details, because I feel like, at least in my presentations, I've been focused on some of the really big issues and then just not had any time to talk about some of the little details. But I did want to even just mention just some of the little details that just make this triumph as wonderful as it is here at the end. And the first thing I even wanted to talk about was Roark's speech. And I absolutely agree with, Rob's comment earlier, where, he said, well, people complain that, maybe Ayn Rand just, really wanted to be this nonfiction writer. And so she's got to, have all of these speeches. But I think Rob is absolutely right that what we see here is someone who really is this fiction writer with all of these really great big ideas. And to me, this even comes out in the writing. So even in this speech, which is, the philosophical speech that he gives in the courtroom, the first thing about this is that it's always been striking to me that it starts off with legends. And to me, that was always interesting, because even as someone who absolutely loves literature, I have to say that I think if I were ever called to a court trial that might determine the next 10 years of my life, and I was going to give a defense of myself, I'm not sure that I would start my speech off by talking about legends. But that's what she does. We're going to get the legends, and really, the way I see it here is she's really giving us the archetypes of, you could call it the egoist versus the parasite or the altruist. It's the first-hander versus the second-hander, the creator versus the dependent. But that's even, how she's going to get us into the speech is through the legends. And I think, it's just so beautifully written, that this is not a dry courtroom speech. It's absolutely literature. So I just wanted to read just the way this opens up. Thousands of years ago, the first man discovered how to make fire. He was probably burned at the stake he had taught his brothers to light. He was considered an evildoer who had dealt with a demon mankind dreaded. But thereafter, men had fire to keep them warm, to cook their food, to light their caves. He had left them a gift they had not conceived, and he had lifted darkness off the earth. Centuries later, the first man invented the wheel. He was probably torn on the rack he had taught his brothers to build. He was considered a transgressor who ventured into forbidden territory. But thereafter, men could travel past any horizon. He had left them a gift they had not conceived, and he had opened the roads of the world. That man, the unsubmissive and first, stands in the opening chapter of every legend mankind has recorded about its beginning. Prometheus was chained to a rock and torn by vultures because he had stolen the fire of the gods. Adam was condemned to suffer because he had eaten the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Whatever the legend, Somewhere in the shadows of its memory, mankind knew that its glory began with one, and that one paid for his courage. And again, this is, I could go on and read so much more of this. And what is so fascinating to me about this whole speech is that, again, even though this is the scene where we are getting the most densely philosophical material of the book, that it's written in this way that really draws on the literature, and there's just even some beautiful poetry in the language. So I just even wanted to read just another, this is one of my favorite little details, just a little tiny literary detail, and it's the choice of a word. And so I just I'm going to read you this one paragraph, and then you can guess which word I love in this paragraph. Okay, so the paragraph says, throughout the centuries, there were men who took first steps down new roads armed with nothing but their own vision. Their goals differed, but they all had this in common, that the step was first, the road new, the vision unborrowed, and the response they received, hatred. The great creators, the thinkers, the artists, the scientists, the inventors, stood alone against the men of their time. Every great new thought was opposed. Every great new invention was denounced. The first motor was considered foolish. The airplane was considered impossible. The power loom was considered vicious. Anesthesia was considered sinful. But the men of unborrowed vision went ahead. They fought, they suffered, and they paid, but they won. So anybody want to guess my favorite word? I will give you a clue. It's a word that is mentioned twice in this one short paragraph. If anybody wants to guess, but my favorite, anybody have a guess? No, we have to look in the chat.
Vision? Is it vision?
It's very close. It's the word that she uses to describe the vision, which is the word unborrowed. To me, that's always so strange because it's such a strange word. It's an uncommon word. It's not, I mean, we would use the word borrowed in English all the time. And I did actually look it up in the dictionary. The word unborrowed does exist in Merriam-Webster, but it's not a word that we ever use, hardly ever speaking English. I can't think of a time that I have ever spoken that word aloud or written it in an essay. And clearly, even when people use the word unborrowed, they're usually using it in a context with borrowed, and it's usually maybe more in the context of borrowing money or borrowing goods. So then even just the fact that she takes this unusual word unborrowed and using that to describe the vision, and I think and Rupali, I think is absolutely right that the key word here is the vision. That's what the creators have. And then she's going to emphasize what's so unique about that vision, and then using such a unique word. Like she could have said they had a unique vision, but that wouldn't have been so unique. But this I think is just just a beautiful little literary detail. And then just one more thing from the speech that I just have to bring up, because Maritza just happened to mention the oath from Atlas Shrugged, and to me this was always one of the most striking parts of this speech, where I see the first glimpse of the oath. And it's almost perfect that Rob read us that passage where Wynand and Ayn Rand talk about what it is for the writer to first find the words. And to me, there's this moment in the speech where you can see she first finds the words that are going to become the oath in Atlas Shrugged, because there's this paragraph. It starts where it says, the egotist in the absolute sense is not the man who sacrifices others. He is the man who stands above the need of using others in any manner, not in his aim, not in his motive, not in his thinking, not in his desires, not in the source of his energy. Again, just some beautiful writing there with just, the repetition and how, she's using just the beauty of the language and the repetition of the phrase to really make this point and build it up. But then there's this phrase: he does not exist for any other man, and he asks no other man to exist for him. This is the only form of brotherhood and mutual respect possible between men. So to me, that it was just always fascinating that we see that when she gets to Atlas Shrugged and she's going to think about, how do we create the perfect society where there is that brotherhood and mutual respect possible between men, that she'd already started to find the words that are there in the oath. But so then, just to end this up, I definitely wanted to end with the very end of the book. And again, I think it is significant that so this is, you might say a philosophical novel, but she doesn't end the book with the big philosophical speech. She ends by giving us that sense of rising. It was, as Rupali said, she's giving us that sense of soaring. And to me, it's just beautiful, again, how she achieves that literarily with this, and yet with such, I think, beautiful content behind it as well. So first, I even just wanted to read to you the end, just to point out first, just in terms of the style of it, how she gives us that sense of the soaring and the rising and the triumph of this moment. And then I just have a few other comments to end with. But so just the way this ends. The hoist swung like a pendulum above the city. It sped against the side of the building. It passed the line where the masonry ended behind her. There was nothing behind her now but steel ligaments and space. She felt the height pressing against her eardrums. The sun filled her eyes. The air beat against her raised chin. She saw him standing above her on the top of the platform of the Winen building. He waved to her. The line of the ocean cut the sky. The ocean mounted as the city descended. She passed the pinnacles of the bank buildings. She passed the crowns of courthouses. She rose above the spires of churches. Then there was only the ocean and the sky and the figure of Howard Roark. So I thought maybe even Sherri was going to talk about this because she had mentioned to us about pressure before and that image of pressure. But here, even how we get that image of what it is for Dominique, we're really getting the experience on her body. And for any of us who have ever, kind of maybe had that experience of, rising up an elevator that goes up a really tall skyscraper, I love how Ayn Rand just gives us this beautiful embodied description of what it's like to be on this speeding elevator, right? The height pressing against her eardrums, the sun filling her eyes, what it is to be blinded by the sun in that way. The air beats against her raised chin. And then even just the symbolic significance of the fact that her chin is raised. Of course, that might be what you would do when you were, sending up this grand elevator, but just the pride of the symbolism of the raised chin and Dominique's triumph here. This is Roark's triumph, but we've also seen that it's Dominique's triumph here at the end. And then I loved even just the very end, how this ends, that, she's going up and she passes the pinnacles. What does she pass the pinnacles here at the end? She passes the pinnacles of the bank buildings, the courthouses, and the churches. And this again, too, reminded me of Louis Sullivan and, what we learned about the concepts of form follows function and, Louis Sullivan's rant of how people cling to the forms. And to me, that was just such a beautiful, moving description of how work is surpassing the forms, right? We have like the old money, the old laws, the old religion and beliefs and moralities, all those old dead forms, and I think it's even significant that that these were perhaps the otherwise tallest structures in the city. And there's maybe something about that makes sense, that in a society, right, it might be, right, the old money and the old laws and the old religions that are gonna get the symbolism of having what would otherwise be the tallest buildings in the city. But that what work has done has, to soar past all of those and into something that is new and undiscovered. And I love how at the very end here, we get both the elevation, the height, because we're literally at the top of the tallest building. So we get that vertical thrust, but then it ends also with the horizontal, the expanse, right? This is the last line, right? There's the ocean and the sky. Right? And if you think of how you experience those, right, that's what it, right? It's the vast expanse of the possibilities that open out before us. And that's where we are, Howard Roark at this pinnacle of, the height and the expanse. And So hopefully, I hope that this is where we all end, not with Gail Wynand and whatever is confusing about him and his tragedy, but with the height and the expanse and the triumph of Howard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Joia, and absolutely. So we got this one, and then we got the next one on Sunday. So we can do wrap up on either of those days. So we'll have a vote afterwards about what people want to talk about, and we'll go from there. Next up is Iris. Iris, go ahead.
Hi there. Okay, I start out with miscellaneous stuff again. I knew that there were many references to Mallory and military, but each time I read it, I find more. I'm not sure if he's ever mentioned without military also. Okay, Guy Francon in ad agencies, graphic design studios, and many architectural studios. There are salesmen. Their purpose is to get the information, bring it to the creative people, actually know how to present the creative work to the customer. And that's what Guy Francon becomes. He presents himself as a designer, but he is actually doing something for the business. Let's see, I tried to get a number, couldn't find it. The Ayn Rand Institute has been inviting people to join various contests with essays, and they give out a lot of money each year. In 2019, they had already gotten 400,000 essays. So at least half of those, probably much more, are about the Fountainhead. It's just interesting to think about all these essays out there about the Fountainhead. Okay, and the kind of crummy people who we've met. Every decade or more, someone has written a book with no letter E, or variants of that. I once read my way through the art library in Chicago. Every decade or so, someone does an all black painting or an all white painting. It's always presented as they're doing this brave thing or whatever. Okay, in the final walk, there's a reference to a wax mannequin in a window. All mannequins were wax at that point. I have a wax doll. It's as hard as plastic and has some of the kind of glow that plastic can have. Well, from the very first conversations that Rourke and Wynand have, Rourke is always saying, no matter what happens to us in the future, this is what I think of you. So, there's a lot of letting us know that this probably is not going to go on forever. Okay, two last things about child raising and my background. My father would always defend children anytime he heard someone talk about terrible Jews. He really hated that phrase. He would explain to people that the child had reached a certain development where they were learning that they could say no to things. This was new. They were experimenting. Asking questions. It was the same kind of thing. This was a wonderful development. Do not call it terrible Jews. And then something I remembered about the way we were brought up. Once we started going to school, we were in charge of getting up ourselves. We were given an alarm clock, and it was not our parents' job to get us up. Okay, last week we were talking about photogravure And I'm probably the only one here who ever read newspapers that had a photogravure part. Photogravure printing technique was first displayed at the Paris Exposition 1867. Newspapers were printed in such a way that they could not, and actually the invention hadn't been done yet, to be able to print gray tones. And so there were, at the beginning, there were no pictures, were just engravings, drawings that artists did for them. The same year photogravure was invented, there was also an invention so that regular printing could reproduce gray tones of photographs. Photogravure is a kind of printing using a rolling plate rather than a flat plate that gets inked and wiped after each inking. The ink is a quick drying ink, and even today, photogravure is used to reproduce art prints and for certain books where they want really fine quality reproduction. The photogravure sections of the newspapers were all in Sunday papers. They ran usually 6 to 20 pages. If you do a Google search for photogravure, rotogravure section, you'll see that these pages are just packed with photos. They overlap each other. They're in shapes, circles. They have outlines. They'll have one thick line and then one thin. Very little type. There'll be some headlines and photo captions. Some pages will be all one very large photo. In fact, each spread is really one reproduction of, however many photos they care to put in. I've seen some great ways of comparing them to the internet. The internet is very heavily about photos, just seeing each other here. The Facebook, all of these things are photo intensive, particularly as compared to radio. And it was interesting to see the development, just as we've had computers and cell phones developing over, with yearly changes over the decades. At this point, new cameras and new printing techniques were developing yearly. It was amazing to see what happened. Those people lived in a version of our world. The sections were often printed in sepia, so you had tan skin tones, but sometimes they were blue, and of course they can be full color too. The New York Times rotogravure ran from 1912 to 1942. But my grandmother subscribed to a Yiddish newspaper that had a rotogravure section. And I don't know when that stopped, but as a child, in some classes, we were asked to bring photographs cut out of magazines and newspapers with certain subjects, and I would always look through that section. Something I learned just yesterday in Rand's notes or a talk, I can't remember where I got it. I was looking tons of things yesterday. Rand considered the winded walk at the end as one of the 2 best parts of her writing in this book. I don't know what the other one was. Guess, but okay, then last part here. There's the book that I mentioned last week, Essays on Ayn Rand The Fountainhead. And it's selling right now between $46 and $16. It has 15 essays. The first one is Shoshana Milgram's. It's 21 pages. You can read 16 pages of it online free. There are all sorts of things we learn about here that she saw in Rand's files. For instance, at first, Rand had Rourke have 2 other women in his life, and then she decided she didn't need them. And so it sounds like both Rourke and Dominique were virgins the first time they were together. And then I printed out some things from that. At the end of the conversation with the dean, in a draft and also in the final text, the dean says, "You are a man not to be encouraged, you are dangerous." In the first draft, or in an earlier draft, Rourke says, "That defines those to whom I am dangerous." And Shoshana says, "The tone is uncharacteristically stiff and formal, indicative of a degree of care and attention." The drafts, Rourke is delivering a diagnosis of his opponents. The response in the final edited version is different. When the dean says, "You are dangerous," Rourke replies briefly, directly, and dismissively, "To whom?" The first version focuses on the nature of his opponents. The second version dismisses the dean's comment as insignificant. Rourke is progressively revealed as first-handed. I mean, these are changes Rand is making as she's writing. Shoshana could see what each change was doing. In his every act and utterance, the reader too is invited to be a first-hander as Rand composes and edits the text. She concretizes characters to the point where the reader is able to grasp directly the character's premises and basic values. In an important note to herself, February 18, 1940, she wonders if she's given away too much of Rourke too soon in the beginning. Her revisions of the opening chapter accordingly show her shortening the description of Rourke's thoughts, especially while he's standing on the cliff before the reader has seen him in action. And just more of that type of thing. Back to the dean in the draft, he continues to insult Rourke, saying, "You are a megalomaniac." And Rourke in the draft responds, "I've been told that before." And then Shoshana says, as if he's been keeping track of opinions of other people, as if he regards their view of his nature as potentially valuable source of reliable information. But Rourke is a first-hander who would not consider other people as authorities on a matters as his character. Let's see, this is later on. Shoshana again writing, she ultimately decided, she said, to omit some scenes and sequences because they contributed nothing that was not already expressed better elsewhere, or because they interfered with the overall design. One example is a sequence of scenes involving Vesta Dunning, a talented, ambitious, romantic, ambitious actress romantically involved with Rourke, whose desire for approval of others was a breach in her integrity, unable to sustain her relationship with Rourke or her pursuit of her art. She was shown in part 4, ultimately miserable and defeated. Yeah, and later she says Vesta Dunning was really just a version of Wynand. The manuscript of early chapters contains numerous changes, small yet significant in expression and emphasis. Even after years of preparation, Rand spent many months writing and rewriting opening chapters to clarify and enhance the theme. Yeah, I was aware when I was reading the last chapters, how perfectly each word made a point. Oh, then what does Rourke think when they first meet? And the novel is silent on that point, except for what one can infer from Dominique's observations and Rourke's subsequent behavior. But in the first draft, by contrast, Rourke looked at her. His first glance at her had been a perception not of sight, but of touch. It was the consciousness not of a visual presence, but of a slap in the face. He grasped nothing save a challenge, like an explosion, like a scream. Then he saw that it was a woman standing on the rocks above, a woman with an invisible stamp, his own stamp, upon a white face that presented him with the complete reality of what he had sought and what he had found but a hint of in others. That face was freedom, a freedom proud enough to warrant enchantment. And then there's a question mark, so it's probably, she's not quite sure what Rand's handwriting is there. It was strength, sure enough of itself to deserve to be fought. It was will great enough for the honor of being broken. He stood very still, looking at her as at a mirror to reflect his power, and knew that he wanted to break this woman, but he could not state what form the act of breaking her was to assume, because he knew it, because there was but one way to it, and more because he knew, because she held by that knowledge, and then something crossed out. He felt his tongue pressed against his teeth, shut tight together, his fingers closed about the handle of the drill as if it was her wrist. If it had been her wrist, the bones would have broken. Were we to speak for the rest of their lives, were they to speak for the rest of their lives, they would have added nothing. Everything was said when they looked silently at each other. There were many things in that glance, but above all, there was a pledge, cold and quiet in its finality, an ultimatum declaring a war. So that's what was going on in his mind. That's what Rand knew. She couldn't figure out why everyone didn't understand that. Back to the dean for a moment. The dean in the draft continues to insult. Oh, wait, it looks very familiar. Okay. Okay, this is the last thing, and this is when in the draft, Rourke shows up at Dominique's bedroom. When Dominique sees Rourke enter her home, she whispers, "What do you want?" He answers, "You know what I want." In the final text, they say nothing. At this dramatic moment, they understand each other without words. And the novel stresses that silent understanding. Ayn Rand originally planned to echo this exchange later in the novel, which it is, after learning that the man from the quarry is the architect of the Enright house. She goes to his apartment, and we get that exchange. Although removing the exchange from the first scene resulted in removing the piquant contrast in the second scene, Ayn Rand decided to do it anyway to avoid interfering with the drama of the wordless romantic encounter. This is the last paragraph. She shortened to the identification of Dominique's emotions during that first encounter. She fought because she could not bear the pleasure. She fought because she hated herself for that pleasure. She fought him because she wanted him too much. In editing this passage, Ayn Rand removed the over-explicit description of Dominique's consciousness. Rourke, of course, understands without words everything Dominique does not say.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Iris. Particularly the description of what is going on in Rourke's mind.
Yeah.
First time. That is very, very valuable. That's really amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the book. I have no idea what else might be in there. I think everyone who wrote essays probably has access to all of Rand's notes.
Mhm. Excellent. Thank you. All right. So now I'm going to open it up for everybody. You're welcome to bring up any topic. This is flexible. I've already announced the meetup next Sunday. So it's going to be Sunday at 5 p.m. Not this Sunday, the next Sunday. So you can talk about any topic you want, including Gail Winan. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it was fantastic presentations again from everyone. I really enjoyed everything. But particularly Rupali really opened up my eyes by linking it to knowledge, because we're this idea in Jnana Yoga, because we think about the idea of the ego, and we talked about this actually just last night. But the idea of the ego, what is it? You know, how does it become creative to begin with? And it begins with knowledge, but not knowledge of external things. It's knowledge of the internal. And that's a very important point that people sometimes miss the distinction with what it means to actually know yourself and essentially go through the process. Because once you go through that, and what we discussed yesterday was there is self-knowledge, you know, that is the deeper spiritual knowledge that allows you then to overcome your pride. It allows you to overcome your fear. You can develop a set of principles for which you can live by. And that is the type of ego that then allows you to be creative, not at the expense of others, but for others in a way. It allows you to act in the world. It allows you to take action in the world. And so that's really, it was an interesting link, because one of the things that you continually see throughout the book is this, how pride prevents people from being able to move forward, you know, whether it be Peter, whether it be Gail Winan. It really does. It's the inability to actually for somebody to essentially accept who they are, and that's a lack of self-knowledge. So I think that links really, really closely with Jnana Yoga as well, and how that worked in for me. I mean, so that was a really eye-opener, because since ego is essentially the center of creativity in the book, how do you then, what does that mean? Like, because again, we always associate ego as acting out in expense of others, and how it's the enemy, and how it's really something not as a good thing. But having a healthy ego, and this is the root of the individual, and this is what Howard Rourke is kind of bringing to the entire world. He's bringing a healthy ego that's willing to have a set of principles, that's not willing to compromise those principles. But that also takes a lot of confidence and self-knowledge. And so that to me is you find your dharma in that process as well, your purpose in life, and it allows you to act out and live your purpose. So that was a very just a really interesting connection that Rupali made for me, and to an extent, I think, I don't know, it just to maybe just comment really quickly on the Gail Winan. I think he's incapable of accepting himself, and I think in a way Howard Rourke just upends his whole worldview, Like he's waiting to hear that verdict almost, because it will somewhat validate his existence if
Yes.
he is guilty. It'll say, okay, you're not the only one that thinks this way. And I think that it invalidates everything that it proves that goodness can exist in the world. And that it goes back, there was a conversation, you know, I remember when Dominique said, what if we're wrong? What if we're wrong, Ellsworth? When they were actually initially talking about Rourke and how there aren't people that act in the world, you know, independently. I forget the exact line, but nonetheless, it was I really think I think Gail Winan is, and to some degree, I think he even may be a nihilist to a certain degree. He has no values and he doesn't believe they exist in the world. So once he sees them, he feels like it really upends his worldview, and I don't think he can handle it at all. So I think there's a degree of nihilism that exists in Gail Winan. That's all. So great comments, everybody.
I just want to respond on one point about Winan. I mean, what Winan had to do after the verdict is from if or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn out tools, and lose and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about your loss. That's what would be required of him to save himself. Next up is Evanique.
Yeah, so I'm kind of sad that this is coming to an end. It's a little bittersweet. I think I have a newfound respect for Ayn Rand. I never thought to read her until this group. So thank you guys for that. I think I want to talk about a couple things since we're at the end. So I think Gail Winan succumbs or surrenders to two things. He wants power, but he wants power to prove to those people in Hell's Kitchen when he was younger that you don't run things. He wanted to prove that he run things, which ultimately causes his demise. And I think what the author, what Rand was saying is that, like, you know, you don't have to prove yourself to anybody. And when you try to prove people wrong about something about you, then you ultimately become what you're trying to disprove, if that makes sense. And I think that's why, you know, she's focused on people having to know themselves, because when you know yourself, you don't have to prove anything to anybody. You just are who you are, and people either accept it or they don't. That's the beauty of work, is that either he's like, either you accept me or you don't. It doesn't concern me. Like when he spoke with Ellsworth Toohey, and Ellsworth Toohey's is kind of like bragging about what he did to him with the Stoddard Temple, and how it worked is like, well, I don't think of you. Like that is the ultimate, and he's not even trying. Like that's the ultimate sentence for me. It's like, I don't think of you. Like you're not a concern to me, because he knows himself enough to know that he doesn't have to be concerned with Ellsworth Toohey, and you can't control what people think of you anyway. I think when somebody had said something about Ellsworth Toohey is against greatness, I think it was in the book. I totally agree, and he's against greatness because he can't control it. I mean, when he's giving that speech to Peter Keating in his room, and you know he's just gloating, I think that's the beginning of the end of Ellsworth Toohey, is because he thinks of himself as ultimately controlling one's soul, right? And because he can do that, but he can't tell anybody about it. He just knows it. So when he's starting to tell people, people will start to see who you are. And you know, that's the loss of power. Um, I think like when I look at the book as a whole, and I'm like, I had to look back and be like, when was this book written? Because besides the whole technology thing, this could have been written in 2022, right? We see it in our world today where a lot of people don't know who they are, and they act to impress other people. And I have to say, which I think is kind of like, if you see it in the world, you like, in terms of like people we know, famous people, you don't really know anybody who's kind of like a Howard Roark, right? But I can see a whole bunch of Ellsworth Tuohys or wannabe Tuohys, but reality who they are Keatings, because they're worried about what other people say and what other people do, and they don't have any sense of self. And I think they are selfless. Like they have no self. They have no. They will capitulate to whatever will get them elected or whatever will make them remain popular. There's a whole lot of Peter Keatings that are just willing to do that, and you see how it destroys people. So I think when Rourke asked Ryan to not, and this is my words, of course, not sell him out, even if it cost him everything. It wasn't for Rourke that Rourke was asking; it was for Wyatt, because to me, Rourke was offering Wyatt a choice, like stand by your principles. Rourke knew it wasn't about him when Wyatt went on his crusade. We saw him and Dominique talk about that. He knew it wasn't about him. But it was about Wyatt, for the first time, maybe in his whole life, standing for something that he believed in. But he was asking him to do it at the expense of everything, because he knew that was what it was going to cost him. And it was like the only way he was going to get to know himself. Now, I find it ironic that he gives up the banner anyway, but I think that's the beauty and it's the beauty and it's the tragedy of Wyatt, right? Ryan, you see it. Like, that's why I think like everybody's like, why Wyatt is such a dynamic character, is because you see that he's trying to change and you see the potential, and you see that all he has to do is make the choice, and who he has to choose is Gail Wyatt. If he can choose Gail Wyatt, he would be fine. He would be mortified. He would be happy with himself. And he doesn't. And that's who Howard Roark is asking him to choose when he says, don't sell me out, even if you have to give up everything. We know it wasn't for Roark, because Roark just figured he's going to jail for burning down the building, right? He already figured that out in his mind, that he may go to jail for it. He do it before he burnt down the building. But he was asking Wyatt to do it so that Wyatt could choose Wyatt, because that was what it was ultimately about. So I think this is a great book. I do think that the reason why Rand doesn't kill Wyatt off and doesn't have him die in the series is because she's showing, I think everyone has a little bit of every character in them at some point. We've all been all these characters. Maybe not Tui. I'm not sure everybody's been Tui, but besides Tui, we've been almost all of those characters at one point in our lives. And I think what Rand leaves us with the character of Wyatt, is that we all have the ability to be who we are. And that's why she leaves Wyatt in. If Wyatt had committed suicide, like, what hope do we all have? Like, Howard Roark is like the ultimate ideal. Wyatt isn't. We can see ourselves more in Wyatt probably than we can in Roark. And so if you can see yourself in Wyatt, you can get to Roark. And just one more quick thing about, I love this relationship between Roark and Wyatt, because I feel like Roark is the progression of Wyatt, and that's why Roark loves him. I think Roark loves him because he can see that Wyand is not meant, and he tells Wyand this, you are not meant to be a second-hander. He knows this of Wyand, and I think that's what makes Wyand so dynamic. We see Peter Keating, he's a second-hander. He will always be a second-hander, even though, and that's because he really doesn't want to do the work. We see that in Peter Keating's character throughout the whole thing. He just cares about what people think of him. He doesn't even care about what he thinks of himself. He's definitely the picture of second-handers, which is where most people stay. Rand gives us hope with Wyand. So that's my thoughts.
Thank you, Evanik. Let's have Tony go first, and then Rob and Sherri. Tony, you're complaining without hearing, without being visible. You're pantomiming your complaint. Go ahead.
I just love to give people a hard time. First of all, I was very frustrated this time because every time I wrote down a note, thought I was being brilliant, someone would say exactly what I was thinking. It's like, stop it already. But I'd like to do a couple of errand things, and then I want to link a couple of things. Sherri mentioned the Howard's orange to Dominique's blue, and of course I was going to say how they were complementary colors, but I thought to myself, well, this is the original, not Game of Thrones, but it's the original Tale of Fire and Ice, because you have Rourke's fiery hair, but you notice that he's the icy character. He's cool, calm, and collected, and Dominique is the icy blue, but she is the passionate character. Well, that's a real interesting admixture. The other thing I wanted to mention, starting off with Robin, I want to go down to what Iris said, but I think Evanik already said this in a way. So Evanik, if I'm duplicating you, I apologize. Rob mentioned audience capture. And this is, of course, de rigueur in today's world. It's like you have the internet, you have the sites on the internet that want to capture an audience so that they can continue selling. But even more than that, you have social media, which you always have to have content, and you don't really care what the content is as long as you bring somebody to your page, even if they're yelling at you. You know, you say, oh, I got 5 million viewers. Yeah, but 250,000 of them hate you. But it's okay, as long as I got the numbers. But anyway, I said audience capture is the very nature of being a politician, because they don't have anything to sell. How many politicians actually do something good for the country? Now, there are those who do, but they're in the minority. Most people are there to serve the purpose of serving themselves in office by saying they're going to serve the country, right? You also have big movements like BLM, Black Lives Matter. It's like, okay, we want to get people on our side. We'll threaten them, or we'll tell them we're downtrodden, whatever. We'll draw in the attention. We'll draw in the money. What have we done? What have you produced? Or even if you go as far as the old rule of thumb for college professors of publish and perish. You know, at first, when I went to college 1,000 years ago, I thought the idea of publish or perish was a good idea. And then I thought to myself, well, that just makes professors want to publish anything. And it doesn't have to be of any quality. So that flips me down to what Iris said about the all black paintings, the all white paintings, and the novels without the letter E, and all this nonsense, which is all it is attention getting or audience capture. It has nothing to do with producing anything of value. And I made an argument to somebody just yesterday, and not that he was disagreeing with me, but we were discussing, I was making intellectual argument. And I said that this is done in art more than any other thing, because you do not have to have a popular marketplace in art. It's a very concentrated marketplace. So it's not like you have to sell 10,000s of your paintings to be considered good. You just have to sell one that somebody will go, oh, look at this. This is Kandinsky mixed with Jackson Pollock. Cool. Okay, and you say to yourself, yeah, and so what? So what they do is they, if I can use a Thomas Sowell phrase, they use verbal virtuosity rather than quality to get you convinced that you should think what they do is quality. So I was explaining to him, the person I was discussing with, that there were a number of books through the years that edged into this, but we couldn't keep it going with the popular, the number of books I'm thinking about are, if you take a look at yeah, great, now I'm forgetting the names. Stream of Consciousness, Faulkner. Well, it's daring, but I dare anybody to pick up a Faulkner book, Sound and Fury, and make sense out of it. You need to buy a college trot to make sense out of it. So of what value was that? Okay, as an experiment, great. If you're going to do the same thing with, now to the other extent, Finnegan's Wake, right? James Joyce even said, I'm going to mess around with all these puns so that the critics will spend the next 20 years or 30 years or 50 years discerning what I really meant. Basically he's saying, I'm going to pull the wool over their eyes. Now, not that they didn't produce also good works, but that type of extreme, like the novel Without Any Ease in It, can't continue, because, and this is the final point I want to make, is that if there is a hope that we can avoid this absurdity, it's the marketplace. Because people will not pay, or at least not for long, will not continue to pay for schlock. They might like it for a moment, but they will not continue to buy that stuff. Well, they'll continue to buy greatness. Shakespeare still sells.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thanks, Tony. Next up is Robin Sherri, followed by Maritza.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about Gail Wynand again.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I have some thoughts as well, but I want to hear.
You do?
first.
Oh, okay. We'll see if we agree or disagree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to jump back to the beginning of part 3, where we see this point when Gail Wynand is actually considering suicide. He's got the gun pointed at his head. He feels the ring of metal at his temple and says, I'm going to die, he says aloud, and then yawns. And he felt no relief, no despair, no fear. If we jump a little forward, it says, one does not die like this, he thought. One must feel a great joy or a healthy terror. One must salute one's own end. So with that, thinking about what happens to Gail Wynand at the end, we know he commits not literal, but emotional suicide, really, when he caves. But think about it. This is a man who's been doing this every day of his life. This is his habit of life. And for that period of time beforehand, for what is it, 1 or 2 months, where he is doing what he knows in his soul is the right thing to do, he holds that for the most extraordinary length of time for this man. But in the end, it's like it's like the alcoholic who returns to the drink. And they do that for a really important reason. There is so much guilt in the real true understanding of what they've created, what they have done with all of those years, that it's an exhaustion of spirit, that it's very hard to continue in the new path. It's very easy, like sliding into old slippers, to fall into the old path. But we have a couple of really important points that we hear here. First of all, he closes the banner or caves in, but then he has that, like Joia said, this brilliant scene where he sits there watching his watch while Tui comes playing with his paper clips and drawing little doodles. And I mean, you don't have somebody stand over you watching their watch while you're trying to write something and just waiting for that tick, 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 the very last second. Again, very cinematographic, of course. That's not the man who has given in, who has committed suicide. This is a man who's taking control in how it closes instead of, he wants to have that. Again, it's a little bit of power. Yes, he's trying to have that power, and he closes it down, but the rest of these papers are still running. And then there's this other detail. He calls Howard Roark to come to his office, not to have any conversation. In force, he refuses any conversation whatsoever, sends the letters back, that sort of thing. But he calls him to the office to start that construction project. And remember, that was really, really important building to him, to build that at the end of his life. So that still leaves us, does he, doesn't he? But I like to point out that the very last scene, this big heroic scene, Howard Roark on the top of the building, Dominique riding up, and it's, I have to complain, everybody, it's not an elevator. She is literally on a hoist with a little chain and a couple of boards. It is a hair-raising ride up the side of a building like that. Rob's afraid.
Never get me on one.
Rob would never. He's afraid of heights.
Sherri designs skyscraper. She can go
I would love it.
on her own.
But anyway, during this fantastic scene, who is there? It's the Wine building. So he's still a presence in this world. So I think, remember when Roark has to wait 7 years for Dominique to make this change, to make the full clarity of thought, to be able to ride up that hoist. I think that what's going to happen with Winan is he's going to get out on that yacht, and he's got an awful lot of thinking to do, and he's got an awful lot of work to do. I think that is again, cinematographic. I think the reason he doesn't actually pull the trigger is because that leaves us at the end of the story hungry for more knowledge. I mean, I know that she wasn't doing this, but it's like she's setting up the sequel. Do you know what I mean? I think that that is the important part, is for her to make us all have that wonder and have that conversation. The is he, isn't he, and to keep that conversation going. But you had something else?
I just had a horrible thought that someday when popular culture finally embraces Ayn Rand, we're going to get the Ayn Rand cinematic universe, and sort of like the Marvel cinematic universe. And we're going to have all these spin-offs, like, well, what happens to get Winan after the Fountainhead? Let's write a television series on that.
Is he still on the yacht?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't want to think about it. But okay, I have a slightly different take on this, which is remember when we talked about this question very much earlier in the first section about why does Roark not take a little bit of money from Austin Heller and keep his office open instead of going off to work in the quarry? And the answer is because the plot requires him to go off and work in the quarry. It requires him to meet Dominique in this position as a common laborer and in this hellish quarry. So, it's so the plot can go forward. He could have, she could have had him make a different decision, but to make the plot go forward, she presents that decision. So you could imagine a Gail Wynand who stays firm to the very end. The banner crashes down, but he's maintained his integrity and he salvages, he's builds it up with worn out tools, as Kipling would have it. We could imagine a Gail Wynand who does that. But he doesn't do that because Ayn Rand didn't want him to do that because she wanted the plot to go a different direction.
Somebody had to build the Wynand building, right?
Well, not just, he could have built the Wynand building in that version, but he has to have that reckoning. What she wants is he has to have that moment of reckoning where he realizes the full extent to which he has to recognize and confront the full extent to which his life has been wrong from the very beginning. Now, remember, this is a guy who never apologizes for anything, right? He makes the point, I never apologized for the banner. And even the name the banner, there's a point where Alvis Garrett says, but Gail, it's our banner, right? So the name of the banner, there's lots of different newspaper names you could pick. The banner is, it's like, this is his banner. This is his manifesto of here's what my life means. So everything that means to him, he has to fully confront, he has to go to rock bottom. She has to take him all the way down to rock bottom. That's why he does that. Because, and I think part of it too is that with this, the same thing with Keating's redemption, the potential for Keating's redemption. I just struck me here, the only minor character, the only bad guy, quote unquote bad guy, he's even not that much of a bad guy, but the only non-heroic character who gets a real redemption arc in here is Guy Franchon, or Guy Franken, and because he's not really the worst of the bad guys either, but he's the only one who sort of redeems himself. But it's a fairly minor character. Well, I think she wants to emphasize the fact that the choices you make matter. That when you make a choice and you go off in a wrong direction, you can't just recover from all that.
No.
When the reckoning comes, it is wholly how devastating it's going to be to have lived on the wrong principles for so many years. So I think as part of it is we have to say is that the reason Franken doesn't make a different decision is because Ayn Rand wanted him to make this decision to serve the interests of the plot and to bring him all the way down to rock bottom so he can have that brilliant passage of her best writing where he's in Hell's Kitchen saying, you never ran anything, you just added yourself to you never left here, you never ran anything, you just added yourself to the things they ran. So she's doing it because she wants to carry him down fully to that realization of what happened to his life. So you guys, there's a work of fiction, some things happen not because you couldn't imagine anything happening. They happen because the author wanted to take the story in that direction.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see who else. Maritza, you're next.
Wait, first I'm just saying, do you guys actually call him Guy Franken? Is that what you say? Guy?
Yeah, it's not Guy Franchon.
I thought it was Guy. I thought it was Guy. Why would it be Guy? That's not a name.
It's an American thing. We're Americans.
Oh, okay.
We pronounce weird stuff like that.
Oh, so it's Guy?
It's like a Midwestern thing. Guy.
I don't
know. That's so funny. I always thought it was Guy. Why would he's French, right? Because okay. Anyway, all right. Sorry, I digress.
We're not saying it's right.
So Maritza, let me tell you a story here, Co. So I grew up in Illinois. In Illinois, there's a town called Versailles. No. there's a town called Versailles. It's
not
spelled
Versailles.
like Versailles, like the palace, but it's pronounced Versailles. There's a town called Cairo. It's spelled Cairo, but it's pronounced Cairo. I used to go to a movie theater in a town called Milan. Milan.
Milan.
No. Milan. And nobody tell her about Lima, Ohio.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Midwest, we like to butcher pronunciation.
It's a God-given given right for Americans to mispronounce foreign words.
Fun. Okay, sorry, she can't. That aside, I just heard him say Guy. I was like, Guy? Is that can't be the name. Anyway, so I actually disagree with Sherri's perspective on Wynand. So I view Winan as so I while I can see that obviously this is a work of fiction, we're seeing things because this is what the author wished for us to see. If I view it from one step above, in that this author was so deliberate in her writing that in addition to, yes, she wanted me to see this, but if I ask myself the why, what I view is that Winan is showing us what happens when we reject change. So what I see happening here with the scenario with him and Tui is that Winan chose the power he wielded before he met Rourke. As I forget who actually said it here, but he would have had to, the deconstruction and reconstruction that Gail Winan would have had to do to himself to get past the moment when he was sitting in the boardroom. And had he agreed to close the banner in that moment, instead of betraying Rourke, in his mind, the cost was too high there. In that moment, he thought himself incapable of surviving that, but he thought it because he knew himself to be too weak to survive that. There are points in our lives that require a pivot and a change, and require is too soft of a word. Life demands no other alternative. Unfortunately for Winan, he found himself in a spot where there's still a choice. Even with that demand, you have the choice to evade at every step in one's life. That's always, plan C, right? You can do A, B, and you're like, those are my only two choices. One can also not act. And even though Winan did say, go ahead, he got up and left the boardroom, he chose to evade. And then to my estimation, that's what we see moving ever forward. He chooses to evade. He is aware that what he perceived to have been power was not true power, but he makes the decision to strive for that old perception of power all the same. The satisfaction he may have gotten from Tui was a pale facsimile of what he used to do. Because remember, he used to chew up and spit out people who had ideals just for fun. That was how he amused himself. He did it with this guy who he perceived to be someone in need of getting cut down, because it's old habits, as it were. And so it makes me think of, we were discussing just yesterday, Joia and I, and a few other of you, we were talking about memes versus genes, right? Because we're talking about the evolving self here with Michal Csikszentmihalyi. And in discussing memes and materialism, we're told, as he looks on the objects he possesses, a man is deluded into thinking of himself as a big deal. It becomes easy to spend one's whole life accumulating property without end just to feed one's ego. And I think that what we see here is that in all the different characters, Ayn Rand is painting the picture of the choices that we make. And somebody did say there's you can't erase the past, right? But she also believes that we're not deterministic. Life is not predetermined. So even though it is a true statement that we cannot erase the past, it's also a true statement that the future is not written in stone. So what you do at this point matters just as much as what you did yesterday matters. And what we see in Gail Winan, from my opinion, is that Gail Winan just gave up. He decided that everything that came before today was such a betrayal of what he should have been, that he could not possibly do anything to affect what was to come tomorrow. And as such, he was going to choose to continue to do the same types of things he had done in the past. But now it's even more vile and more disgusting, because now he absolutely knows that that's the wrong path for him. Before, he was going down the wrong path, not entirely aware of it, but now he knows it and he chooses. And the only way for him to continue to choose that is to swallow and disregard his emotions. And so I just view him as this cautionary tale. And I understand that they didn't actually kill him, but it's because, you know, one can be dead and still be walking around. And I think that's where he is. And, you know, I had said earlier on throughout the whole novel, if we view this from the perspective of these characters are an embodiment of the various different moments of self that we have. And, you know, Evanique just reminded us of that as well. He's that cautionary tale of not giving up, because, you know, tomorrow's not set in stone. And that's the way I view him. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Maritza. So my take on Winan is, you know, he starts out by being first-hander as a kid, and tries and fails and concludes early that you can't transform the world being a first-hander. So you have to follow what the world is doing. And he uses his first-hand capacity of thinking to actually execute in a brilliant way to create this empire, and tries to, you know, cater to his first-handedness in his gallery and on his yacht. So that was his state. Then he meets Rourke, where he can see the first-handedness, and he loves the first-handedness genuinely. So he becomes friend with Rourke. He has him build the house. He tries to destroy it, and then he says, okay, this is actually the real thing. You know, it's not even, I can't destroy it, but I don't want to destroy this. And so that goes on. Then Rourke, with the Cortland explosion and the trial, creates a choice for him. He's always thought that he rules the public opinion, and he tries to use use his power over others in order to support Rourke. Tries. Can't be done. Finds out it can't be done. It basically was destroying the banner. Then he is faced with the choice. What do I care about more? And he chooses banner. He gives that up and chooses banner. I think that this I realized only now, okay, that you have to realize that he closes only the New York banner. All his other papers, which are doing exactly the same thing, he wants to keep running. So he has not given up. He actually has chosen to continue it when he gave up on Howard Rourke. What he's saying is that, okay, I'm going to choose the banner. I'm going to choose the banner. Then in the trial, what does he find out? He says, well, I could have been otherwise. It is possible for not only Howard Rourke to exist, but people in general thinking that that is okay. If that is true, all my life, I've been doing the wrong things. Okay. So that was his, must have hit him very badly, but he had already made the choice that he's not going to let the banner go for the right thing. And he continues to run the banner after this. And he knows that he has made the choice. And when he has made the choice, he knows that the pretense of the first-handedness that he had, the soul that he had, is dead. And he needs to build a monument to it so he can see it outside. And that's what the Winan building is, just a monument to saying, this is what I could have been, should have been, did not become, It is there, and he chooses to run the banner rest of the time. So I see it as a monument. And the great thing about even that action is that he has no pretense about that. He's saying, look, there is nothing. This is just supporting it. It's all yours. He's telling Howard Roark, I don't have a pretense that this is actually my spirit. This is what my spirit could have been and should have been. So that's how I see the progression. Next up is going to be Evanique, followed by Joia. Evanique.
Yeah, so I think Maritza, I should have wrote it down. But you know what, pass, because I can't remember what I was about to say.
I tell you folks, you have to.
I know, and
you're
I
going to be hit with
forgot.
so many ideas that no matter how great idea you think you have, it's going to be blown away with the flow of things. All
I
right.
know.
Next up is Joia.
Well, hopefully when I'm talking, it'll come back to Evanique what she wants to say, because now I'm curious what she's going to say. I just want to say, I realized that I actually do have something I want to say about Gail Winan, but I don't want to say it until after we all watch the movie for the first time or again. So I'm going to definitely be on the side that in the meeting, we should spend a lot of time talking about Winan. But I still think we should end with Howard Roark. But I did want to say something in response to what Sherri said, going back to that same passage she quoted. And usually Sherri is the one who brings up all the great color references for us, but she didn't bring up what I think is the great color reference here, where Winan, in that moment when he's actually holding the gun, in the part 3, he doesn't shoot it because he thinks his death is going to be a gray death. And it's striking to me that I think in the end, what we see is that he kind of does have something like a gray death. It is very muddled. Even as Shrikant was pointing out, it's like he chooses the banner, but then he's going to give up the actual banner that's in New York City, maybe because of, and then, like, why that one? Like, is it because he wants to get back at Ellsworth Toohey? Is it because it's New York City?
To point out, this is Joya's. You can see Joya's, how his prejudiced she is. Like, she says, New York banner is the actual banner. And then
yes. The New York banner is the actual banner. And I really do think that there is some kind of symbolic significance that he'll let the other papers in the rest of the world go on, but the New York banner, that's the one that counts. But again, right, it's just very muddled. It does end up being a gray death, but I do have some more to say about that we'll share after we watch the movie.
Sure. So about the New York banner, I think it's a question of his power against Toohey, and against, it's a way of, he has to establish his power. So he just shuts down the New York banner. The rest of it, he's fine. He's running the banner. It just shuts things down, which has opposed him. So it's a way of, it's a power decision, nothing to do with Howard Roark here.
And just one more thing I wanted to say too, something that I just started thinking. So something interesting about Ayn Rand's biography that we know, she always says, so we know in her mature view, she comes up with a very distinctive and original view about free will, where she defines it as the choice to think or not, and it's the choice to focus versus drift and evasion. But she always says that she actually never came to that precise formulation until the period after The Fountainhead and before Atlas Shrugged. So I'm even just curious if, we can see, I guess, even in this book that, a lot of her views about the importance of choice are definitely there implicitly in terms of what it is to be the Fountainhead and the choices that the characters are making. But I always wonder if maybe even the book would have been slightly different if she had that more explicit formulation of free will that she comes to in her mature thinking when she was writing this novel. Just throwing that idea out there.
All right, folks. So we're going to do the meetup. Maritza, so it is going to be next Sunday at 5 o'clock. There was, you correctly pointed out that there was another meetup I had scheduled, which was a wrong time. So I've removed that. So Fountainhead, we are meeting next Sunday at 5 p.m. for closing thoughts. So all the panelists are welcome, and everybody else who has participated is welcome to do that. So
watch the movie if you haven't already.
Yes, if
we have homework.
You can watch the movie, but I suspect Maritza has watched the movie because she thinks Winan shot himself. I don't know.
I have never watched the movie. Wait, does he actually shoot himself in the movie? Oh, wow. No, I haven't seen the movie yet. Oh, he shoots himself in the movie?
Oops, no. No.
I didn't know. No, I gotta find it. I'm gonna have watched it by next Sunday.
Oops. Okay.
But I didn't watch it yet.
All right. Okay. All right. So thank you very much. I think couple of people we need to talk. So anybody who wants to continue with conversations, you can remain here. I think Rupali and Sherri want to talk. I've opened up breakout rooms for you guys. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. It was great to see you.
All right. Wonderful.
Bye,
And
guys.
Evanik, I want to talk to you about your series too. So if you could join the breakout room as well. Bye,
Yeah, you can
everybody.
join us. Bye.
Wait, I'm joining a breakout room?
Yeah. Oh, actually, you don't need to join the breakout. Just a second. Okay, I'm opening the room, but you don't need to join. Oh, just a second. Uh-oh. I moved everybody into breakout rooms. Sorry. No, but it's in separate breakout rooms. So Rob and Sherri, you're fine. You can just go ahead and say yes and join.
It's no longer here for us to say yes to.
No?
Wait a minute. Hang on, maybe down here.
Okay, I'm going to
You
move you
hit
to.
join?
I'm
join.
going to. Yeah, go ahead and hit join.
Okay, we're gonna join.
Okay, very good. Okay, folks. All right, let's see. All right, Iris, see you. I'm going to talk to Evanik about her series. So Evanik, so this is, I'm very excited. So I like everything that you're proposing. I like the the book is great. I've not read the book, but I know Brian very well. So his you've looked at the book, right?
Yeah. I got it. And we talked about it on the phone.
Okay, perfect. So I think it's all good. I think once a month is perfect. Ideally, what I want to do is I want to do it on a weekday so that you get the best audience.
Okay.
Now, the thing is, we've got, when would you ideally like, how many, when would you like to do the first one?
Well, I know we were talking about doing the launch in May. So
In May? Okay. Okay,
yeah.
so then that's perfect. So what I'm going to do is I don't want the Tao Te Ching meetups to end. Okay, the Tao is eternal Tao, and we have such a good community. And there is an Indian solution to it, to these things. So I'm going to use that because Indian thinking is, see, Tao is eternal. So Tao, the Chinese thinking is all eternal. It's like, okay, Tao is eternal. Western thinking is that, okay, it was beginning, now it's come to an end. All good things have to come to an end. Okay. Indian thinking is cyclical. So the cyclical solution to it is that we're just going to change the frequency of the Tao meetups. Instead of being once a week, we'll do it once a month.
Ah, okay.
So what will happen is that people who are interested in Tao will keep coming back, and we will do all kinds of high level topics with it. So we're going to do 2 more meetups with the Tao. So, we're going to wrap up 8081, and then we're going to do 1 meetup for celebrating Jason's translation. That's the last, remember that we have done one where we just do the reading of his translation. I think we have come up to 60. So from 60 to 81, we will do that. So we'll do 2 of the Tuesday meetups, and then Tuesdays are going to be available for anything anybody wants to do. So from then on, the Tao will be on one Tuesday. So let's say first Tuesday of the month or second Tuesday of the month. You guys pick some other Tuesday of the month.
Okay.
And so that way it will be, you will get a better audience on Tuesday night than on Saturday night. Does that work?
Yeah. So any Tuesday but the first Tuesday, right?
It doesn't, I mean, if you want first Tuesday, you can take it. There is nothing fixed right now for the Tao. So Tao, let me see. So today is what, 2nd. So on, let's give a little bit of leeway to Joe and Jason. So in any case, even if 80 and 81 take 2 meetups, the final meetup will be on 19th. So May is wide open. So you can pick anything in May. So
Okay.
you can say, okay, but ideally the best thing to do is always to choose like Tuesday, like first Tuesday or last Tuesday is probably the best thing, because then people will remember it in their mind. Do you think you'll be ready by the first Tuesday?
In May?
Yeah,
Let me talk to Brian and see, because I know him and Penny are going out of town.
sure.
They're taking 2 weeks in April
Okay,
to travel and to see their family. And so let me talk to him and
sure,
ask him
sure. So,
if he'll
so
be ready.
right. So pick any Tuesday. So you guys decide amongst yourself and pick
Okay.
any Tuesday. My preference is for an earlier one because earlier we get started, the better. Always. I'm very excited.